Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Darkveil. Tonight, we're bringing you 16 of the most disturbing true trucking stories ever submitted to this channel. These accounts come from long-haul drivers, dispatchers, and the families left behind. People who spend their lives on empty highways at 3 a.m., not around a campfire making things up. What you're about to hear is too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. Every detail has been cross-checked against dispatch logs, highway patrol reports, and local records, and more than one of them lines up with something real. Tonight, a distress call from a driver who's been dead for decades, a hitchhiker who says thank you, days before you learn he died at that exact mile marker. Mile markers that start counting down instead of up. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. We believe in slow burning, authentic horror over cheap jump scares. And if you've got your own story from the road, drop it in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Now kill your dome light. Let's begin. I drove Highway 101 for 31 years, mostly the run between Aberdeen and Port Angeles, right through the gut of the Olympic Peninsula, where the road narrows to 2 lanes, and the rainforest closes in so tight on both sides. You can smell the wet moss through the dash vents, even with the windows shut. That stretch by the Hoh River doesn't get easier with time. The curves drop and bank blind, one after another, and in 3 decades I watched more than a few rigs go off the shoulder into the ferns and not come back the same. I'm telling you about one particular thing I started hearing on Channel 19 out there, because I never got a clean answer for it, and at some point you stop needing one. Mostly. It started on an ordinary night, if any night out there counts as ordinary. Rain coming sideways, temperature sitting right where the marine air off the coast meets the warm breath rising out of all that timber, which is the kind of night that turns the radio strange even without any help from anything else. I had the CB on low, mostly out of habit, listening for anybody warning about a downed tree or a slide, when a voice cut through the static, calm at first, then not. A man's voice, saying he'd jackknifed just past the Hoh turnoff, said his trailer was hanging over the edge of the grade and his brakes were gone, asked if anybody copied. I keyed up and answered him twice. Nothing came back but the hiss. I figured it was Skip, a signal bouncing in off some rig 50 miles down the coast, distorted by the weather. That explanation held up fine for about 2 weeks. Then it happened again, same stretch, same kind of night. Same voice, almost word for word. I started paying attention to the pattern, instead of brushing past it, which is a habit 30 years behind a wheel teaches you whether you want it or not. Fog, temperature inversion, rain at that particular pitch that hits the windshield like gravel. Every single time those conditions lined up, somewhere between mile marker 178 and the Hoh Road cutoff, that same call would come through. I mentioned it once on the open channel, half joking, asking if anybody else out there ever picked up a phantom jackknife call on that grade. The channel went quiet for longer than felt natural, and then an old driver named Curtis, who'd been running seafood trucks up that coast even longer than me, came back low and just said,
"Yeah, don't go looking into it."
That was the first time I understood I wasn't the only one, and somehow that made it worse instead of better, because it meant this wasn't in my head. I didn't listen to Curtis. I pulled off at the Hoh turnoff on my next run-through and walked the shoulder in the rain with a flashlight, and about 40 yards down, half swallowed by sword fern, I found a small marker, wood gone soft and gray, the paint on it worn down to almost nothing. I had to get down on my knees and run my thumb over the letters to read them. A name, a date, almost 30 years back. I stood there a long while with the rain running off my hood, because up until that moment, this had been a strange radio signal. Now it had a name. I called it in to dispatch the next morning, not really sure what I was even asking for. Our dispatcher then was a woman named Fran, who'd been with the company almost as long as the company had existed. And when I said the name off that marker, she went quiet on the line, the same way Curtis had gone quiet on the radio. She finally told me yes. She remembered him, a driver who ran that same route for us decades before I ever got my CDL, and that he'd gone off that exact grade one night in weather, just like what I kept describing. Brakes failed on the downhill pull. Trailer took him over before he could get it stopped.
That confirmation should have closed the book for me. Instead, it opened about 6 more questions I didn't know I had. Fran, once she started talking, kept talking. She told me that curve had taken more than him.
2 other rigs went off almost that same spot over the years, decades apart, always loaded, always in rain, always breaks. The company had petitioned the state twice to get a runaway ramp put in on that grade, and gotten nowhere both times. That's when I stopped thinking about this as one man's death and started thinking about it as a place that had killed people more than once and just kept quietly doing it, which is a very different and much colder thing to sit with at 2 a.m. on an empty highway. I might have let it rest there if I hadn't run into an old CB Club member at a truck stop outside Aberdeen. A few months later, a retired operator who used to keep reel tapes of radio traffic back before anybody thought to worry about that being useful someday. On a hunch, I asked him if he had anything from that decade, that stretch. He dug through a box in his garage for me over a weekend and came back with a cassette, hiss and all. And on it, buried in old chatter about way stations and weather, was the original call. The real one, from the real night, decades old. I sat in my truck in that parking lot and listened to it twice, and it was not similar to what I'd been hearing on the road. It was identical. Same words, same order, same tone, breaking in the same place. That tape is the reason I never went back to telling myself it was Skip, bouncing off some live driver down the coast. A live driver doesn't say the same sentence, in the same voice, 30 years apart. Around that same time, I mentioned the driver's name to my own father, who'd hauled that coast a generation before I did, mostly out of curiosity about whether he'd known him. He had. More than known him, the man had trained my father when my father was 22 years old and green enough to still be scared of the grades. My father hadn't thought of him in years and got quiet when I brought him up, the same quiet I was getting used to by then. Suddenly, this wasn't a stranger's ghost story anymore. It was somebody who'd shaped, in some roundabout way, the very career I was sitting in a truck cab having this conversation from. For a couple of years after that, the calls kept coming on the right kind of nights, and I got almost used to them, the way you get used to a sound your own house makes. Then one November, running that stretch in weather, bad enough that dispatch was telling everybody to consider laying up, I heard something different. A young voice this time, not the old one, panicked in a way that sounded fresh, instead of worn smooth by repetition.
A newer driver on our line, a kid named Cody who'd only been running that route a few months, said he was losing his trailer on the grade, brakes gone soft, same words almost, same place. Except this time, nobody answered him back with silence. This time, it was happening.
I ran that stretch faster than I should have, in that rain, engine brake growling the whole way down, and came around the bend to find his rig, jackknifed half off the shoulder, trailer swinging out over the drop the same way the marker, 30 yards further down the ferns, had described happening decades before. I got him out of the cab before the whole rig gave up the ground it was holding on to. He was shaking too hard to talk straight for a good 10 minutes, but once he could, he told me something that put ice straight through my chest. He said a voice had come through his radio right before he lost the brakes, telling him to downshift now, calm, clear, using his exact mile marker, and that voice was the only reason he'd slowed enough to survive going off, instead of just going over. That changed the whole shape of the thing for me. I'd spent years assuming I was listening to a tragedy on a loop, a wound in the road that just kept bleeding the same way forever. But if that call had reached Cody in time to save him, then whatever I'd been hearing all those years wasn't repeating its own death.
It was trying to stop somebody else's. I went and found the family eventually, an address Fran dug up from old company files, a modest house outside Forks, with a widow in her 80s, who still kept his old CDL photo on the wall. I told her everything, feeling foolish about half of it, but she didn't blink through any of it. She told me something the state troopers had noted in their file back then that never made the papers. His last transmission that night, before the crash, hadn't been a call for himself at all. There'd been another truck close behind him on that grade,
and his last words on the radio were a warning to that other driver to hold back, that the road ahead was bad, seconds before his own brakes gave out under him. He'd used his last working breath warning someone else, and the check on our shipping logs showed that other driver made it home safe that night and drove another 20 years after. Whatever kept coming through Channel 19 all these decades later wasn't a haunting in the way I'd always assumed. It was a man still doing the last thing he ever did on this earth, over and over, for anybody who happened to be listening at the right moment. I'm retired from the long hauls now, mostly running short local routes closer to home, but every so often, maybe twice a year, when the fog sits just right over that grade and the rain hits that particular pitch, I still switch to Channel 19 out of habit more than anything, and every so often it's still there. The last time I heard it, a few months back, the voice gave the same break warning it always gives. Same tone, same place in the sentence where it breaks. Except this time, right at the end, it added a mile marker I didn't recognize, one a little further down the grade than I'd ever heard him give before. I haven't driven past that new marker at night yet to see what's sitting in the ferns there, and some part of me isn't in a hurry to find out. I just know that when the weather turns right on that stretch, I still reach for the radio, and it's still there, waiting for whoever's coming down that grade next. Cole Bennett had been driving log trucks for 6 weeks, and every one of those 6 weeks he'd had Denny Okafor sitting in the jump seat behind him, watching his mirrors, correcting his downshifts, telling him when he was riding the brake too hard on the grades. Tonight there was nobody in that seat. Tonight was his first solo run. Hoot owl hours. The kind of pre-dawn haul the outfit only ran in July and August, when the woods got dry enough that the state made them shut down cutting and hauling by mid-morning to keep sparks off dead grass. That meant loading in the dark and running the main line before the sun came up, and it meant that at 22 years old, 3 weeks past his commercial license and 2 days past Denny signing off on him, Cole was alone at the wheel of a loaded Kenworth T800 at 1:45 in the morning, easing off a landing on Forest Road 29, outside Forks, with 40,000 pounds of Doug fir stacked and chained behind his head. He liked the quiet of it, if he was honest. The engine brake settling into its rhythm, the smell of diesel and cut wood, the 2 cones of his headlights carving a tunnel through timber that pressed in close on both sides of the gravel, 11 miles of switchbacks and washboard between the landing and the blacktop of 101, no other trucks running this early, dispatch a crackle of static on Channel 19 if he needed them. He keyed the mic once, told them he was rolling, got a board copy back, and then it was just him and the road and the low hum of tires, finding every rut in the gravel. Around mile 3, something moved along the ditch line to his right, keeping low in the sword fern, and he eased off the throttle out of instinct, because you learned fast in this country that elk didn't care about right-of-way, and neither did the deer, and a collision with a full load behind you could put the whole rig in the ditch. He caught a shoulder, a haunch, something the size of a yearling elk, loping easy through the brush at the edge of his headlights, and he let his foot settle back onto the pedal, already forgetting about it, already thinking about the scale house and whether he'd make his 4 a.m. window. Except it didn't fall behind. He watched it in his peripheral vision for another 1/4 mile, waiting for it to cut back into the timber, the way game always did once a truck passed it, and it didn't cut back. It held, not sprinting to keep up, not falling away, holding, matched exactly to his speed, like a second vehicle running parallel with its lights off. He eased the throttle down to 32 through a soft curve, and it slowed with him. He came back up to 40 on the straight after, and it came up too. No lag, no scramble, just there, pacing him through brush. An animal that size shouldn't have been able to move through that clean and that fast, without ever breaking stride into his sightline. He told himself it was a game trail running parallel to the road. That was the only thing that made sense. A natural clearing under the tree line, letting whatever it was travel in a straight shot while he had to follow the switchbacks. That explanation held for about 1.5 miles, right up until the road doubled back hard on itself, climbing a shoulder of clear cut, a turn tight enough that his headlights swept across the same stretch of ditch twice in 10 seconds, and the shape was in both sweeps, Same distance out, same rough shoulder height against the brush, having somehow crossed the inside of that turn faster than anything running on 4 legs through slash and downed limbs had any business doing. He wanted to test it and hated that he wanted to. He let off the pedal hard, felt the engine brake bite and the whole rig shudder down through 28, 25. And in the mirror, the movement along the tree line slowed to match him inside of what felt like half a second. No drift, no overshoot. The kind of instant correction you'd expect from a driver watching a speedometer, not from a set of legs in the dark reacting to sound. He pushed back up through the gears to 40, and it came with him again. Patient, exact, and somewhere in his chest, a small cold certainty started forming that had nothing to do with elk. He grabbed the CB mic, mostly because he needed to hear a voice that wasn't his own thoughts. He keyed 19 and said something half-joking about having company on the 29, figuring somebody on graveyard dispatch or another early hauler out of a different unit would rib him about spooking himself on his first solo night. What came back instead was a different driver's voice, older, flat, cutting in fast before Cole had even finished the sentence. Asked him if he was past the Y junction yet. Cole said he was coming up on it. The voice told him to hold his speed, don't touch his brights, and don't call it out again on the open channel. Said it like an instruction, not like a joke. Said it like a man reading off a checklist he'd read off before. And then the channel went quiet. No sign-off, no laugh, nothing. Just static where a conversation should have kept going. Cole sat with the mic still in his hand for a good 10 seconds, staring at it, understanding for the first time that whatever this was, he wasn't the first person on this road to see it, and that the other drivers who knew about it had agreed, without ever needing to say so out loud to each other, not to talk about it where it could hear them. The Y junction came up a half-mile later, a fork where an old spur road split off toward a landing that hadn't been logged in years, brush already reclaiming the gravel. Just past it, the main line hugged close enough to a rock cut that his west mirror caught a clean, close look at the tree line for the first time all night, floodlit by his own running lights bouncing back off the stone, and for maybe a second and a half he saw it plainly enough to know it wasn't an elk, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything he had a word ready for. It moved upright. Not the stiff shuffle of a bear standing to look at something, but a loping, sustained upright gait, arms swinging long past where a man's arms would stop, shoulders rolling with each stride, in a rhythm that was almost like something jogging alongside a car it had decided to keep pace with for its own reasons. Then the rock cut ended, and the mirror went back to swallowing plain dark, and Cole realized his hands had locked so hard on the wheel that his knuckles had gone bloodless. He didn't get another clean look for almost 2 miles, and in that stretch the fear stopped being a thought and became a physical thing living in his chest, his breath going shallow, sweat cold at his hairline, despite the cab being cool. Somewhere around mile 7, something struck the back of the load, a hard, flat thud against the stakes on the driver's side, followed by the unmistakable rattle of a binder chain jumping against steel, and every trained instinct in him screamed to stand on the brake and check his load. He got his boot halfway to the pedal before the trucker's voice from the radio came back to him, flat and certain. Don't touch your brakes. And he made himself hold 40 through the shudder of it, made himself keep his eyes forward instead of hunting the mirrors. And somewhere behind him the chain rattle settled and didn't come again, and he understood, in the way your body understands things faster than your mind can argue with them, that whatever had made contact with his load had done it on purpose, testing the truck the same unhurried way it had been testing his speed. It was somewhere in that stretch, hands shaking on the wheel, that a piece of training he'd filed away as an old man's superstition finally clicked into place, as instruction instead of color. Denny had told him, his second week out, half laughing about it over coffee at the landing before a run. Never brake on the 29 past the Y. Never flash your brights at anything you see along there. Hold a steady speed till you hit blacktop, and if you ever do have to stop for real, stay in the cab. Doors locked, engine running, until it's light out. At the time, Cole had taken it as hazing, the kind of thing veteran drivers told rookies to see if they'd repeat it and get laughed at. He hadn't asked why. Now, alone on the road at 2 in the morning, with his heart slamming against his ribs, He remembered something else Denny had mentioned once, and never brought up again. A kid who'd run this same route the year before Cole came on. A decent driver by all accounts, who'd asked to be moved off nights after about a month, and then quit the company outright a few weeks after that. No explanation given, no explanation asked for. The kind of thing that happens often enough in trucking that nobody thinks to add it up until they're sitting exactly where that kid must have sat. The road climbed one more grade before the long final descent to the highway, and it was on that grade that the shape did something that broke the last piece of Cole's certainty about what he was dealing with. It had been running the ditch line on his right for 3 straight miles, steady as a shadow, and then for a stretch of maybe 40 seconds it simply wasn't there. No sound, no movement in the mirror, nothing. And Cole let himself hope, for exactly as long as that hope lasted, that it had finally peeled off into the timber and gone. Then his headlights swept into the blind curve at the top of the grade and caught motion crossing the road itself, not behind him now but ahead, cutting from the right side to the left through the beam in 2 long strides before vanishing into the black beyond his high beams, having somehow closed a 1/4 mile of rough second-growth timber faster than he'd covered it on gravel. Every instinct told him to brake, going into a blind curve with something unknown having just crossed it. Denny's voice told him not to. He held the wheel, held the throttle, and drove into the curve blind, trusting a rule he didn't understand, from a man who'd never fully explained it, and came around the bend doing 40, with his stomach somewhere up near his throat. What was on the other side of that curve was a spur landing nobody used anymore, an old sodium work light still bolted to a stump-side pole and somehow, impossibly, still lit, throwing a sick orange wash 20 yards into the timber, and standing at the very edge of that light, at the exact place where the throw of the bulb gave out and the dark took back over, was the thing that had been pacing him for 11 miles. It didn't run, it didn't lunge. It stood at the tree line, with its head turned toward the road, tracking the truck the unhurried way a man might watch a car pass on a road he'd stood beside 100 times before, wide through the shoulders, dark and wet looking down the front, like something that had been rained on for days. Its proportions close enough to a man's that some old animal part of Cole's brain tried to call it a person and failed, because no person stood like that. Weight settled back on legs bent a full joint wrong, watching a 40,000-pound truck go by with the calm of something that had never once needed to be afraid of it. Then the sodium light was behind him. The road straightened into its last long chute down toward the highway, and in his mirrors, Cole watched the tree line go dark and empty, the pacing gone, nothing keeping speed with him anymore, like whatever had been running that stretch of road with him had reached some line it didn't cross, and simply let him go. He hit the stop sign at 101, doing better than he should have, sat there through a green light, with his hands locked on the wheel and his whole body shaking, and then he pulled out onto the blacktop and drove the rest of the way to the mill without once looking at the mirrors again. He scaled his load at 4:10 that morning, signed the ticket, told the scale house guy nothing, and sat in the cab in the mill yard for almost 20 minutes afterward before he trusted himself to drive the empty truck back to the yard. He gave his notice 3 days later, told dispatch it wasn't a good fit, told his mother it was too many hours for the money, and told Denny, alone, out by the fuel island, the actual truth, expecting to be laughed at. Denny didn't laugh. He just nodded once, slow, the way a man nods at something he's heard before and hoped he wouldn't hear again, and told Cole he'd made the right call, and didn't say another word about it. Cole never drove that road again, and he mostly managed not to think about it, until almost 2 months later, when a guy he'd worked with at the outfit, someone he was still loosely connected to online, posted something in a local trucking group, asking if anyone had heard what happened on the 29 the week before. Cole read the thread standing in his kitchen with his phone in his hand. A new hire, a guy Cole had never met, had taken over the same hoot owl route not long after Cole left, and one morning in September he hadn't checked in at his 4 a.m. scale window. They found his truck nosed into the ditch near the old spur landing. Engine still running, driver's door hanging open, load still chained down tight, and no sign of the driver anywhere on the road or in the timber on either side. The company statement, when there was one, called it a probable medical event, and said the driver had likely wandered off, disoriented, and that search efforts had been called off after 2 weeks with no results. There was a small item about it in a local paper and then nothing. The way these things tend to go quiet once nobody with enough weight is left asking. Cole still drives trucks. Different freight now, different roads. Nothing that takes him within 50 miles of that stretch of gravel outside Forks. But every so often, passing a log truck heading the other way on some interstate on-ramp, he finds himself doing the math without meaning to. How many miles that new driver must have run before whatever paced Cole for 11 miles decided he wasn't going to be let go the same way, and how long it must have already known the exact rhythm of that road, the curves, the sodium light, the Y-junction, before either of them had ever turned onto it for the first time. I've been driving trucks for 16 years, the last 9 of them as my own boss, and in all that time, I kept exactly one rule that I never broke. I don't pick up hitchhikers. It isn't meanness. It's just math. A woman alone in a cab at 2 in the morning doesn't get to be careless, and everybody who's spent real time on the road has a story about the one night somebody did and regretted it. So when I saw him standing on the shoulder of State Route 20, past the turnoff for Rainy Pass, thumb out and his head hanging like he didn't have the strength left to lift it, I told myself I was going to keep rolling like I always did. I didn't. It was the last week of October, the week before the state gates the pass for winter. Once the snow starts piling up over Washington Pass, they close SR-20 clean through until spring. And every driver hauling that corridor knows the calendar, the same way farmers know frost dates. I had one more run in me before the road shut down for 5 months. A reefer trailer of seafood out of Anacortes, bound for a distributor east of the mountains, and I was pushing hard through weather that had turned from rain to something colder and meaner the higher I climbed. No other headlights for 20 minutes. No radio past a certain elevation, just the hiss of a dead channel and the diesel hum of the reefer unit keeping the trailer cold behind me. And then him, standing in my high beams, like he'd grown up out of the gravel. He climbed into the cab without a word, and the first thing I noticed, before anything else, was that he wasn't shivering. It was maybe 34 degrees with the wind cutting sideways off the ridge, and his canvas coat was soaked through enough that I heard the water in the seat cushion when he sat down. But he wasn't shaking, wasn't hugging his arms in, wasn't doing any of the things a half-frozen body does on instinct. He just sat there with his hands flat on his knees, looking through the windshield, like he was watching something out there I couldn't see. I asked him the normal things: where he was headed, what happened to his vehicle, whether he needed me to call anybody once we hit a signal. He didn't answer any of it, didn't even turn his head. I've hauled through some quiet country and sat with some quiet people, but this was a different kind of quiet, the kind that makes you start filling the silence yourself, just to make sure you're still in a normal world. I talked about the weather. I talked about the deadline I was chasing. He never once looked at me, and after a while I stopped trying and just drove, heater roaring, wipers slapping, the smell of wet canvas filling up the cab. We came up through the switchbacks below the summit, the kind of grade where you're riding the Jake brake the whole way, and your ears pop twice before you level out. I glanced over once, just to check on him, and for half a second in the dash lights, I could have sworn his eyes were closed, though I hadn't seen him blink the entire ride. Then, out of nowhere, low enough that I almost missed it under the engine noise, he said 2 words. "Thank you." That was it. The only thing he said the whole trip. I looked over to ask him for what, and the seat was empty. Not empty, like he'd slipped down or curled up against the door. Empty. Seatbelt still buckled across nothing. Still clicked in the way it clicks when a body's weight is holding the tension, except there was no weight there anymore. My doors lock automatic past 5 miles an hour, a safety feature the insurance company makes you run, and I was doing 40 on a mountain grade with sleet coming sideways. Nobody opens that door at speed without me feeling the cabin pressure change, without a blast of that wind and cold hitting me in the face. I felt nothing. I heard nothing. 1 second there was a man breathing next to me, and the next there was a buckled belt holding down thin air. I pulled onto the shoulder so hard I nearly locked up the trailer brakes, threw it in park, and walked all the way around that truck in the sleet with my flashlight, checking the sleeper, checking underneath, checking a stretch of empty highway in both directions that a man on foot couldn't have crossed in the time it took me to blink. There was nothing. No footprints starting fresh in the gravel. No sound of him crashing off through the brush. Just rain coming down through my flashlight beam, and my own breath going ragged in front of my face. I told myself it was exhaustion. I'd been up 19 hours by then, pushing a deadline, running on gas station coffee, and everybody who drives long enough eventually hallucinates something on a dark stretch of road, a shape that isn't there, a deer that turns out to be a mailbox. I got back in, finished the grade, and made my delivery with my hands still not quite steady on the wheel. That night, parked at a truck stop outside Omak. I couldn't sleep, so I did something I don't usually bother with. My rig runs an inward-facing camera, mandated by the company I lease freight through for insurance purposes, and it archives rolling footage to a card I can pull. I sat in my bunk with my laptop and scrubbed back to the timestamp. I found myself pulling over on the shoulder near Rainy Pass, found the door opening, found the cab lights flickering on the way they do, and I heard my own voice on the recording, asking a stranger where he was headed. But the passenger seat, the whole 11 minutes of it, showed nothing but a dark shape of window fog and rain-streaked glass. No man, just me, alone in the frame, talking into an empty half of the cab, like it was the most normal thing in the world, and somewhere under the engine noise, so faint I had to run it back 3 times to be sure I hadn't invented it, those same 2 words. Thank you. I didn't drive again for 2 days. But the pass gate was closing that Friday, and I had one more scheduled haul that would pay enough to matter. So Thursday night, I found myself back on SR20, telling myself I'd been overtired, that fatigue does strange things to a person's head, that I was not going to be the kind of driver who lets one bad night take a good route away from her. I stopped in Mazama for coffee before the last stretch, at a little store that doubles as the only thing open for 40 miles that time of year, and the woman behind the counter and I got to talking the way you do, with somebody in the middle of nowhere at 10 at night. I mentioned, half as a joke on myself, that I'd picked up a hitchhiker earlier in the week near Rainy Pass, who'd given me a scare. Described the coat, described how he never shivered, never spoke, except at the very end. Her hand stopped on the register. She told me a man had died right around there, at that exact mile marker, the week before I picked him up. His truck had broken down on the shoulder in the rain, no cell service up that far, and he'd started walking toward the summit looking for a signal or a flag down. They found him 2 days later, down in the brush below the guardrail, past a bend where the shoulder narrows out. His name was on a laminated notice still taped inside the store's door, the kind of thing small highway towns put up when somebody local gets lost. Daniel Cobb, 44, headed to see his daughter. The notice had his photo. It was him. I drove the rest of that night on autopilot, the kind of numb where your hands do the work, and your head is somewhere else entirely. And somewhere past the summit, I started doing math I didn't want to do. Daniel Cobb died the week before I picked him up, on a Tuesday night, in weather just like the weather I'd been driving through when I found him. I run that same corridor most Tuesday nights. Same rough window, same load pattern, same everything. Because that's how owner-operator work goes. You build a route, and you stick to it for the fuel stops and the timing. So that night, back at the yard, I pulled my ELD history, the electronic log that tracks every mile and every minute I'm required to keep on file, and I found myself exactly where I was afraid I'd be. I had run that stretch the week before, the same Tuesday, within an hour of when they believe he went into the brush. I still had the archived dashcam file from that date. I almost didn't open it. I sat with the cursor over it for a long time before I finally did, and there it was, time-stamped, undeniable. My headlights sweeping past a stalled truck pulled half onto the shoulder near that same mile marker, hazards flashing weak and yellow through sheets of rain, and in the side mirror for 1 full second, a man's shape stepped out toward the road with his arm up. I remember that night now. Actually remember it, not just the footage. I remember slowing down. I remember thinking somebody else had probably already called it in, that WC. Patrols that corridor regular, that I was running late and the weather was bad enough that stopping felt like its own kind of risk. I remember speeding back up. I didn't know his name was Daniel Cobb. I didn't know I was maybe the last headlights he ever saw. I still drive SR20. The seasonal gate opened again in May, like it always does. And I was back on that road within the first week, because it's my route and it's my living, and I wasn't going to let a mountain pass beat me. But I don't pass a hazard light on a shoulder anymore, not in any weather, not ever again, no matter what it costs me on a deadline. And every time I come up through that stretch past Rainy Pass, right around that 1 mile marker, I go quiet, radio off, both hands on the wheel. I don't know what I'm listening for. Some nights, I catch myself glancing over at the passenger seat out of habit, half expecting to see a soaked canvas coat and a pair of eyes fixed on the windshield, and there's never anything there but rain on the glass and the sound of my own tires on wet pavement. I never picked up another hitchhiker on that road again. I never had the chance to. I've been a dispatcher for 11 years, mostly night shift. Mostly the kind of freight nobody thinks about until it's late. You get a rhythm. You know which drivers stall on cold mornings, which brokers pay on time, which loads are just gravel and grain and nothing to remember. So when I tell you about the night of the 3 trucks, I need you to understand, I've turned it over so many times it doesn't feel like a memory anymore. It feels like a report I keep filing to myself, waiting for someone to tell me it's closed. It started as a phone call, not a booking. That's the first thing that should have told me something. Our normal freight comes through the load board, or through Deb up front. Everything logged with a confirmation number before a truck ever leaves the yard. This came in on my direct line a little after 9 at night. A man who gave his name as Ludlow and said he was arranging transport for a firm called Meridian Site Services, contracted for overnight relocation work out near the Hanford Reach. He wanted 3 trucks, flatbeds with tarps, ready by midnight. He offered triple our standard mileage rate and said half would be wired before the trucks left the lot. I checked the account 20 minutes later, and the money was already sitting there, clean and confirmed. More cash than we'd see off a single job in a normal week. That kind of certainty doesn't happen by accident in this business. It's the kind of thing that makes you stop asking questions, because the questions feel like they might cost you the money. I called Denny Ostrander first, because he'd been driving for me longer than anybody, 22 years, steady as a fence post, and I trusted him to read a bad situation before it turned into one. He brought his own rig around, no complaints, said triple rate for a milk run out to the Reach sounded like Christmas. I paired him with Cole Bragg and Ray Fenn, both solid, both licensed for oversized loads. 3 trucks, 3 drivers, 1 gate code texted to my phone, 20 minutes before pickup. No dispatch address, just coordinates on an unmarked Forest Service road off the old river grade, north of the security perimeter. I told myself, government contractors do this all the time out there. Half of that land still answers to federal agencies that don't explain themselves to a trucking company in Pasco. I'd heard of drivers hauling remediation equipment out to the site under non-disclosure. No plate readers, no manifest details beyond a container count. It happens. I told myself that a lot that night. The pickup itself was where the ground started tilting, though none of us called it that at the time. Denny radioed in once the trucks reached the gate, said there were 2 SUVs already parked there, no county plates, no company markings, and 2 men in plain jackets who didn't introduce themselves, just handed over paperwork and pointed at where to back the trailers in. The bills of lading Denny read to me over the radio had no weight listed, no commodity description beyond sealed containers, do not open, no consignee name, nothing but a job number that didn't match anything Ludlow had given me on the phone. Denny asked me straight out if I wanted him to walk if the manifest didn't check out. And God help me, I told him to load it. I told him the money was already in the account, and Meridian would be gone by morning if we made this difficult. He didn't argue. That's not who Denny was. He just said, "All right, boss," and the radio went quiet while they loaded. For the first hour after they left, everything ran the way any night run runs. Check-ins on schedule, mile markers called out. Nothing unusual besides the escort vehicles staying close on their bumper the whole way, which struck Cole as strange enough that he mentioned it twice. Then around 1 in the morning, Denny came back on the radio, and his voice had changed. He said the SUVs had signaled them off the route we'd been given, off the paved grade, and onto a dirt cutoff that wasn't on anybody's GPS, deeper into the restricted land, past where the public monument boundary sits. He said there was a sign, hand-painted, no agency insignia, telling all civilian vehicles to turn back. He said the escort waved them through anyway. I asked him if he wanted me to call it in to Ludlow, get confirmation, and Denny said, "Hang on." And that was the last full sentence I ever heard him say. I tried the radio for 2 hours after that. Static. Then nothing. Then the kind of dead air that makes you check your own equipment because you don't want to believe the problem is on the other end. Around 3, I called the number Ludlow had given me, and it rang once and then gave me the 3 tones that mean a line's been disconnected. I pulled the account information for Meridian Site Services to cross-reference their DOT authority, the way I do for every new broker, and the number came back to a company that had dissolved 4 years earlier, filed as inactive with the Secretary of State, no active officers, no forwarding address. The wire transfer sitting in our account, the one I'd checked twice that night to reassure myself, had come from a routing number that traced to a holding account with no business name attached at all. I sat at my desk with the phone in my hand and understood, in the particular way you understand things at 4 in the morning, that I had sent 3 men and 3 trucks out to a location I could not verify, for a company that did not exist, escorted by men who never gave their names. Just before 5, headlights came up the yard, and for one bad, hopeful second I thought it might be all 3 trucks rolling in together. It was one flatbed, Ray Fens, trailer empty, tarp gone, backing crooked into the lot, like he'd forgotten how the mirrors worked. I went out in my coat over pajama pants and found Ray sitting behind the wheel with the engine still running, hands still on it at 10 and 2, staring through the windshield at nothing in front of him. He didn't answer when I knocked on the glass. When he finally rolled the window down, his eyes moved to me, but didn't seem to land anywhere, and the only thing he said, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like his, was that he'd been driving alone all night. Just him. One truck. I told him no, Ray. There were 3 of you. Denny and Cole went out with you. And he looked at me like I was the one not making sense. Said it again, slower, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. One truck. No convoy. He didn't remember a gate. Didn't remember an escort. Didn't remember the dirt cutoff Denny had called in over the radio 2 hours before his own truck went dark. I've worked with enough drivers through exhaustion and shock to know what disorientation looks like. And this wasn't that. This was a man reciting a version of the night that had been placed in him, not one he'd lived through and gotten confused about. I called our fleet company to pull the telematics off Ray's unit, thinking the GPS breadcrumbs and the engine hour logs would at least tell me where the truck had actually gone, since the man behind the wheel clearly wasn't going to. What came back didn't help the way I wanted it to. According to the unit, Ray's truck had never left our yard. No mileage logged since the day before. No route data. No border crossing into the restricted grid at all. Like the whole night had been erased at the source, rather than just gone missing. But the truck itself told a different story. There was river silt packed into the wheel wells, the kind of pale gray clay that only sits along the reach, and the fuel gauge showed 110 miles burned that the odometer refused to confirm. Somebody had gone to the trouble of making the paperwork and the data agree with each other, and forgot that mud doesn't lie the same way a hard drive does. I did what I thought any responsible person would do next, which was call it in. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and then, when they transferred me twice, the Washington State Patrol District Office, and told them 2 of my drivers and their loaded trucks had gone missing on a contract job near the Hanford Reach the night before. The trooper who eventually called me back was polite, in the specific, careful way people are polite when they've already decided not to help you. He told me there was no record of any commercial vehicle activity logged on those service roads that night. No gate access requests filed with the monument office. Nothing on record for a company called Meridian anything. When I asked how a federal access road gets used without anyone logging it, he said that wasn't a question he could answer, and the call ended shortly after that. I went to my own boss next, half expecting him to be as lost as I was. Instead, he already knew. Somebody, he said, had called him that morning, before I'd even gotten Ray inside the building, telling him the Meridian contract was being handled and that Basin Freight should consider the matter settled, whatever that meant. He told me not to file anything with corporate, not to call the papers, that our insurance carrier had already been notified the job would be marked complete and paid in full. No claims outstanding. I asked him who called him, and he wouldn't say. I asked what happened to the wire transfer, the deposit that had been so quick to land in our account, and he told me to check the ledger myself. I did. It was gone, reversed out clean, like it had never come through at all, except for the paper printout I'd made at 11 that night, out of nothing but habit, the kind of thing you do 50 times a year and never think will matter. Ray Fenn didn't come back to work after that week. I drove out to his place once, a rental on the edge of Pasco, and his landlord told me he'd cleared out 3 days earlier, left most of his furniture, paid the month in cash, and didn't leave a forwarding address. His sister, when I finally tracked her down, said Ray hadn't called her since, that the last time they'd spoken, he told her he needed to go somewhere he could think, and she hadn't pushed him on it, because that was Ray's way, always had been. She didn't know anything about a convoy, or a contract, or Meridian, and when I asked if the company had ever reached out to her, she said no one had. As far as anyone outside my dispatch office was concerned, Denny Ostrander and Cole Bragg had simply never been assigned a load that night. No record existed to contradict that, except mine. I still have the printout. It's folded into a manila folder I keep at home now instead of at the office. The deposit confirmation with the routing number nobody could trace. Denny's mileage log up to the point his radio went dead. A photo I took of the silt in Ray's wheel wells before the truck went back into rotation and got washed. None of it proves where they ended up, and none of it explains why a piece of land the government has spent 70 years being careful about still has roads nobody wants logged and men in unmarked SUVs willing to escort a truck down them in the middle of the night. I still take late calls. I still send drivers out on jobs I don't fully understand, because that's the work, and most of the time the money's clean, and the freight is exactly what the manifest says it is. But I write down everything myself now, in a notebook that never touches the company system, because I learned that a job can vanish from every official record in the space of a morning, and the only thing standing between that and the truth is whatever you were stubborn enough to keep for yourself. Denny never called. Cole never called. And somewhere out past that hand-painted sign on the old river grade, there's a gate I still think about, and a job number that never matched anything, and 2 men I sent out there, because the money was good and I didn't ask enough questions in time. Roy Kessler had been hauling freight for 26 years, long enough that the job had stopped feeling like an adventure sometime around year 3, and started feeling like a marriage. You learned the moods of your truck. You learned which gas station burritos would hold up past Yakima and which ones wouldn't. And you learned, more than anything else, how to be alone without it eating you alive. That night, he was running a reefer trailer of processed salmon out of Aberdeen, up along Highway 101, cutting through the Olympic Peninsula toward a distribution center outside Port Angeles. Rain had been coming down since Hoquiam, not hard, just steady, the kind that turns your wipers into a metronome you stop noticing after the first hour. Somewhere past Lake Quinault, a road crew flagged him down. A slide had taken out a section of the highway near Solduc, they said, mud, and a stand of alder down across both lanes. Wouldn't be cleared till morning. They handed him a paper map with a route marked in yellow highlighter, a detour along what the flagger called an old logging spur that would spit him back out onto 101, 20 miles up. Roy had done detours like this a dozen times. He thanked the kid, rolled up his window, and turned off the highway onto a road with no name on any sign, just a number bolted to a post that had rusted past reading. The gravel was tight, and it narrowed the truck's world down to 2 headlight cones, and whatever they touched. Douglas fir and cedar crowded in close on both sides, packed the way second-growth timber gets packed, planted in rows, so even the shapes of the trees start to rhyme with each other. He passed a cedar about 4 miles in that had been split clean down the trunk, probably an old lightning strike, one half still standing, green and stubborn, the other half rotted out and slumped against its twin, like a man leaning on a friend. It was the kind of tree you'd remark on to a passenger if you had one. Roy didn't have one. He just noted it the way you note anything on a road like that, and kept driving. He passed it again 19 minutes later. He almost let it go. Told himself the forest was doing what forests do, repeating itself. Cedar splits happening more than you'd think, from wind throw and rot, especially with the storm patterns this stretch of coast got. But something in his gut had already flagged it before his brain finished making excuses, and 40 minutes after that, headlights swept over the same broken trunk a third time, and this time, Roy saw the strip of blaze-orange tape someone had tied around the standing half years ago, sun-bleached to the color of a fading bruise, snagged and fluttering in the same exact place. Not a similar tree. The same tree. He knew it the way you know your own front door. He pulled the truck over as far as the ditch would allow, and sat there with the wipers going and his hands still on the wheel, doing math that didn't work. The road had no turns wide enough for him to have looped back around. No intersections he'd passed, nothing but a single ribbon of gravel walled in by timber. He got out into the rain and walked back 50 yards with his flashlight, looking for a fork he might have missed, a spur he could have drifted onto without noticing. There wasn't one. There was one road, going one direction, and somehow it kept bringing him back to a lightning-split cedar with a strip of hunter's tape tied around it, 16 years ago. If the fade on that tape meant anything at all. He climbed back in, told himself it was fatigue, that 11 hours behind the wheel could do strange things to a man's sense of distance, and he kept driving, because the alternative was sitting still in the dark, and sitting still felt worse. The next time he came up on the cedar, he was ready for it, and instead of just looking, he stopped the truck, got out with a rag from behind the seat, and tied it around a low branch himself, tight. 3 knots, marking it the way you'd mark a trail if you were worried about getting lost. Except he wasn't lost. He was on a single road with nowhere to turn, and that was the part that made his hands shake tying the knot. 22 minutes later, his headlights caught fabric fluttering against bark, and it was his rag. He sat with that for a long moment, because it broke something more specific than his nerves. It broke the story he'd been telling himself about déjà vu and exhaustion. Because déjà vu doesn't tie a knot for you. He grabbed his phone off the dash mount. No signal, which wasn't unusual out here, but he'd expected that. What stopped his breath was the clock. His phone read 2:47 in the morning. He'd turned onto this road, according to the dashboard clock, and the notation he'd made in his logbook out of pure habit, at 11:52 the night before. Nearly 3 hours. He checked the truck's engine hour meter, a number that ticks up only while the engine's actually running. No way to fake it. No way to set it back. It agreed with the dashboard clock. 3 hours. Near enough. But the odometer, the actual distance traveled, showed just under 12 miles since the detour started. 12 miles in 3 hours on an empty logging road was a number that belonged to a man walking, not driving. He looked at his fuel gauge next, and it hadn't moved either. Not in any way that matched 3 hours of a diesel engine running at even an idle crawl. Whatever was passing out here, it wasn't matching itself up on any of the instruments he had left to trust, and it wasn't agreeing with itself either, like the numbers had been asked to lie in more than one language and hadn't quite gotten their stories straight. He picked up the CB, more out of reflex than hope, and keyed it. Anybody out there? This is Kestrel. I'm on a logging spur off 101 near Sol Duck. I think I need some help out here. Static came back, the ordinary kind, and then under it, something that wasn't quite static. A voice pulled thin and distant, repeating words back at him with maybe a 2-second delay, close to his own cadence, but not his words exactly, like a man translating a sentence he'd only half heard. It said something that could have been near Sol Duck, or could have been I need help, and Roy sat there with the handset against his ear, feeling something cold settle into his chest, because for one long second he'd been sure, absolutely sure, that the voice answering him was his own. He set the handset down and didn't touch it again. Somewhere on what his odometer insisted was mile 9, though he'd have sworn to a judge it was closer to 20. His headlights caught something low in the ditch on the passenger side that didn't belong to the forest. He slowed, and it resolved into the shape of a truck cab, sunk at an angle into blackberry bramble and young alder that had grown up through its open windows. Rust so complete, it had gone soft and lacy at the edges. tires rotted to threads. A logging truck, older than his own, by decades, from the shape of the grill. The kind of rig that would have been running these roads back when this whole spur still had a purpose. He didn't want to stop. He stopped anyway, because some part of him needed to know if what he was in was survivable. And that cab was the only evidence of another human being he'd found since the flagger waved him off the highway. The door came open with a shriek that felt obscenely loud against how quiet the woods had gone. Inside, Moss had taken the bench seat and threaded through the wreck of the dashboard. An old CB handset still hung on its coiled cord, and against every reasonable expectation, when Roy pressed the button out of some dumb compulsion, static hissed out of it, powered by a battery that by rights should have been dead for 30 years. Tucked into the visor was a logbook, water-damaged but partly legible, the handwriting gone shaky over the last pages, and even through the mildew stains Roy could make out a driver logging the same landmark over and over. A split-seater, hour after hour, the entries getting shorter and less steady until they just stopped, dated the summer of 1974. Tucked behind the logbook was a company patch, half rotted, but Roy recognized the shape of the eagle stitched into it before the fabric gave way in his fingers, because it was the same patch stitched onto his own jacket, from a company that had been swallowed by 3 mergers since but still kept that old logo stamped on a breakroom wall as a piece of history. Somebody driving for the same outfit he drove for, now, 40-some years back, had gone missing on a road that, as far as company lore went, nobody could ever say for certain had existed. Roy backed out of that cab like it might close its jaws on him and got back into his own rig, shaking hard enough that he had to sit for a full minute with his forehead against the wheel before he could put it in gear. He drove after that with his headlights doing their work and his eyes doing something closer to praying, watching the tree line for a break that wouldn't come, counting the passes of that split-seater without meaning to. 4, 5, he lost count around 8. And somewhere in there he stopped being able to tell if the engine hour meter mattered anymore, if any number in that cab meant anything at all, because the only clock he trusted by then was his own pulse, and that one had sped up past any 12 miles worth of driving a man ought to need. Then, the way a fever breaks, it just stopped. The tree line opened, the gravel widened and smoothed into old chip seal, and up ahead, impossibly plain and impossibly welcome, was a green highway sign with a route number on it that matched 101. He came out onto the highway at a spot he didn't recognize, no landmark from his trip down, no sense of having arrived from anywhere at all, just there, suddenly, like a hand had set him down. His phone found 4 bars of signal before he'd gone a mile. The dashboard clock read 4:58 in the morning. However long he'd actually spent on that road, the world outside it had apparently agreed to let him back in only 5 hours after he left it, and Roy took that as close enough to mercy that he didn't ask it any more questions. He pulled into a gas station outside Port Angeles, with his hands still not fully steady, and before he did anything else, he called dispatch to explain why he was 6 hours behind schedule, already rehearsing an apology for a story no dispatcher was going to believe. The woman who answered, a scheduler named Denise he'd talked to 100 times, sounded confused before he'd even gotten a full sentence out. She said he'd already called in, hours ago, from a payphone. She remembered it specifically because nobody used payphones anymore, and she'd had to look up if the number even still routed. He'd told her the detour went smooth, given her an estimated arrival that Roy had never calculated, and asked her, strange for him, to pass a message to his wife Carol, that he loved her, and he'd call when he got in. Denise said he'd sounded tired, said he'd sounded like himself. Roy stood in the gas station lot with the phone against his ear, and the rain easing into a fine mist, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like a man losing his mind. He hadn't called Denise. He hadn't touched a payphone. He hadn't told anyone he loved them from the side of this road. Not tonight. He drove the rest of the route in a kind of silence that had nothing to do with the radio being off, delivered his load, and clocked out. Weeks later, sitting at his own kitchen table with Carol asleep upstairs, he pulled up every map he could find, State Forest Service records, old logging company plats a friend in permitting dug out for him, Satellite images going back as far as the archives went. There was no unnamed spur off 101 near Sol Duc. There never had been. Not in any record anybody could produce. No numbered post. No detour ever logged by the department that supposedly sent a flagger out that night. Roy stopped looking for the road after that, not because he stopped believing in it, but because some nights, lying next to Carol, he found himself wondering less about where that road had gone, and more about what, exactly, had used his voice to call her, and whether it had really hung up when it said it would. Renee Castellano had 14 years of long haul behind her, and a rule she never broke, which was that if WSDOT put out a winter storm warning above 4,000 feet, she found pavement to sit on before the pass told her to. So when the radio started calling for a foot of snow above Snoqualmie by nightfall, she peeled off at the chain-up pullout the drivers called the Vista, a wide gravel shoulder cut into the mountainside, where on a clear day, you could see clean down into the valley, and on a night like this, you could see maybe 30 feet past your own headlights. She was hauling a reefer trailer of insulin and other temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals bound for a distribution center outside Seattle, which meant she couldn't just kill the engine and ride it out. The trailer's cooling unit needed diesel to keep running, the cab needed heat to keep her alive, and her fuel gauge needed to last until whatever hour the plows finally came through. She backed into a spot at the far end, alone, no other rigs in sight, and told herself that was a mercy. Fewer trucks meant fewer strangers, and fewer explanations she'd have to give in the morning about why she'd stopped early again. The knocking started a little after 11, 3 raps against the driver's door, even and unhurried, like a hand tapping out a rhythm it had practiced. A pause, just long enough to let her heart catch up. Then 3 more. She sat up in the sleeper so fast, the blanket slid off her shoulders, and her first thought, the reasonable one, was that somebody else had pulled in behind her and needed help. Maybe a hiker who'd gotten turned around. Maybe a stalled car. She climbed into the driver's seat, cracked the window enough to call out, and got nothing back but wind. She unlatched the door and pushed it open against the drift, piling against the running board. Flashlight up, and there was nothing there. No car, no headlights, no footprints leading up to the truck. Nothing but her own boot prints from 4 hours earlier, half filled in already. She stood in the open door, long enough for the cold to bite through her socks, before she pulled it shut and threw the manual lock, telling herself it was ice cracking off the mirror bracket, telling herself the mountain made noises at night that a person from the flatlands just wasn't used to. It was the dash cam that took that explanation away from her. Her company had installed a dual-facing unit 8 months back, 1 lens on the road, 1 on the cab, both with audio and enough night vision to pick up a raccoon at 40 yards. And when she pulled up the footage on the little screen mounted below her visor, she heard the knock clear as anything. 3 sharp raps picked up plain on the audio track, time-stamped 11:04 and 47 seconds. She scrubbed back and watched the video that went with it, watched her own door from the outside angle, snow falling steady in the infrared glow, and there was nothing there. No arm, no shape, no shadow crossing the frame. Whatever had made a sound loud enough for a microphone to catch clean had made it without existing in front of a camera that didn't blink and didn't scare. She called the WSDOT road conditions line a little after midnight, mostly for an update on when the plows might start their sweep, and mostly, if she was honest with herself, because she wanted to hear a human voice that wasn't her own, rattling around the cab. The dispatcher gave her the usual, closures likely till morning, avalanche control possible at first light, and Renee, making conversation, mentioned offhand that something had been knocking on her door out at the Vista pullout, some kind of animal probably, and the line went quiet just a beat too long. The dispatcher told her, in the careful voice of someone choosing words, that the Vista had a file on it. 2 winters back, a hiker had gone missing off the Pacific Crest Trail access near there, in a whiteout almost identical to this one, and the search had been called after 9 days with no body, no gear, nothing. It wasn't the kind of thing they put on road signs, but the crews who worked that stretch knew the name, and some of them didn't love parking there overnight anymore. Renee had 2 bars of signal, which up on the pass in a storm was close to a miracle, and she used it to search the hiker's name the second she hung up. The article that came up was 3 years old, local paper, a photo of a young man in a red jacket standing on a summit somewhere sunnier than this. Buried in the comments, a woman claiming to be a family friend had written something that made the hair stand up on Renee's arms even before she'd finished reading it. She said the boy's father used to teach him a knock as a kid, back when they lived out past North Bend. A signal so his mother would know it was him, and not a stranger at the cabin door after dark. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. She said the father still did it sometimes, out of habit, when he came to visit her family's place. Renee read that twice, then looked at her own door, and felt something in her chest go cold in a way the heater wasn't going to fix. She might have sat with that fear all night if her body hadn't given her a different, more practical one to worry about. Her head had started to ache somewhere in the last hour, a dull pressure behind her eyes that she'd chalked up to stress and bad coffee. But when she caught herself struggling to remember if she'd locked the door once or twice, she made herself stop and think it through the way her training told her to. Idling engine, heavy snowfall, an exhaust pipe that could be packing solid with drift, without her ever seeing it happen from inside the cab. Carbon monoxide didn't announce itself. It just made you tired, made you confused, made you see and hear things that weren't strictly there, right up until it made you stop breathing. The ghost story had scared her, but this thought terrified her, because it meant she couldn't trust her own head anymore. And a woman who couldn't trust her own head had no business staying inside a sealed cab all night waiting for morning. Getting out to check the tailpipe took more nerve than she expected it to. The wind had picked back up, and the flashlight beam barely made 10 feet before the snow ate it whole. But she found the pipe half-packed with drift, exactly like she'd feared, and she spent 5 miserable minutes clearing it with a tire iron, her hands going numb through her gloves. She was almost back to the door when her light caught something snagged low on the truck's front step, a scrap of orange fabric, synthetic, the kind used in cold weather gear, torn and stiff with ice but not old, not sun-bleached, not something that had been hanging there for 3 winters. Someone had been at her truck recently. Not a ghost snagging fabric, a person with a body that could tear on metal and leave a piece of itself behind. She was back inside for less than 20 minutes when the last knock came, weaker than the others, uneven, like a hand that didn't have the strength left to keep the rhythm it had started with. She sat frozen for a second, then made herself do the thing every part of her training told her not to do, alone in a whiteout, which was open the door and put her light out past the step, out toward the tree line, and shout into the wind that she saw him, that help was coming. For 1/2 second, in the wash of her flashlight before the snow closed back over it, she thought she saw a shape, hunched, moving wrong, folding down into the drift near the trees. Then it was gone, and she couldn't have said under oath whether she'd truly seen a person or the shape her own exhausted eyes had built out of falling snow. What she didn't do was go out after it alone. She'd cleared the exhaust, she'd seen the fabric, and every year of experience she had told her that a woman on foot in a whiteout looking for a shape she'd glimpsed for half a second was a woman who might become the next name in a file nobody put on a road sign. Instead, she got on the radio, and then her phone, gave the dispatcher her exact mile marker, described the fabric and the direction of the shape as best she could, and then sat with her hand on the door latch and her engine running clean until the sky over the ridgeline started going the flat gray of early morning, and headlights finally came grinding up the grade behind a plow. The search and rescue crew found him 40 yards into the trees, a little after 7, alive, barely, curled against a downed log with frostbite creeping up both hands, and a body temperature low enough that the paramedic riding with them said later he had no business still being conscious. He wasn't the boy from the newspaper photo. He was the boy's father, 61 years old, who'd been coming back to these mountains every winter since the search was called off, camping rough near the trail access, with a tent and a thermos and a stubbornness nobody in his family could talk him out of, looking for some sign of his son that the official search had missed. Disoriented, half frozen, wandering blind through a whiteout not far from where the boy had vanished, he'd found Renee's truck by accident and knocked the only rhythm his hands still remembered how to make, the one that used to mean, "It's me, don't be afraid," and then wandered off again into the dark before she ever opened the door, too far gone in the cold to know he'd found anyone at all. He survived. They told her that much before she pulled back onto the interstate that morning, foot still numb in her boot, cargo still holding temperature, 3 hours behind schedule, and grateful for every one of them. She drove the rest of the grade in a silence that had nothing to do with the radio being off, turning over how close she'd come to writing the whole night off as her own head playing tricks, and how a man had been 50 feet from her door the entire time, alive, cold, knocking out the only thing he had left to say. Del Hobart had been driving trucks for 22 years, and in all that time he'd learned exactly one rule that mattered. The road doesn't care how tired you are. He was thinking about that rule at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, somewhere past Packwood on Highway 12, with 40 minutes left on his log before the system locked him out, and he'd have to pull onto a shoulder that barely existed and sleep, sitting up until his clock reset. Rain had been coming down since Yakima. Not hard, just steady, the kind that turns the high beams into a wall of white noise and makes the center line disappear if you stare at it too long. The load was cedar, 42,000 pounds of it, strapped down tight behind him, and the delivery window at the mill in Morton closed at 6 a.m. Whether he made it or not, he had the radio off. He'd stopped listening to anything but the wipers an hour back, because voices, even the DJs, made him want to close his eyes and just listen instead of watch. The foothills came up on both sides of him now, black shapes against a sky that wasn't quite black, timber close enough to the shoulder, in places that you could reach out the window and touch bark if you were fool enough to try it at 60. She was standing in his lane on the bend just past the old mill turnoff, maybe 200 feet out, close enough that his brights caught her full. A woman, not moving, arms down at her sides, facing him like she was waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. He didn't have time to think the word ghost, or the word person, or any word at all. His hands did it before his brain caught up, cutting the wheel hard right, and then correcting left to keep 42,000 pounds of cedar from putting him into the trees, the trailer fishtailing once, twice, tires screaming against wet asphalt, and for about a second and a half, Del Hobart genuinely believed he was going to die on Highway 12 for a woman he'd never met. He didn't die. He got the rig straight, got it stopped on what shoulder there was, engine running, hazards ticking, hands locked on the wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white, and stayed that way even after he pried his fingers loose. He sat there for a full minute before he trusted his legs enough to open the door. The rain had eased to a drizzle by then. He walked back up the bend with his flashlight, playing it over wet asphalt, over the ditch, over the wall of trees, and there was nothing. No woman, no footprints in the mud, at the shoulder, though the mud there was soft enough to hold a boot print from a deer, 40 yards back. No sound but water dripping off branches and his own breathing, which he could hear too clearly. He told himself deer. He told himself 17 hours awake, and coffee that had gone cold 3 exits back, and a mind that plays tricks on you in the dark when you're staring at wet pavement long enough. He'd heard other drivers talk about it. Road hypnosis, they called it. Seeing shapes that weren't there, because your brain gets starved for something to focus on. It happened. It was documented. It had almost certainly just happened to him. What made it different was that his phone buzzed before he even got back in the cab. The company had put event recorders in every truck in the fleet 2 years back. After an insurance audit, small camera units mounted behind the mirror that watched the road and watched the driver both, flagging anything the accelerometer read as a hard swerve or hard brake, and uploading the clip straight to the safety office and to an app on Del's phone at the same time, so nobody could say a tape got lost. He'd hated the things at first, felt like being watched by his own dashboard, but he'd stopped thinking about it the way you stop thinking about the mirror itself. It was just there, recording, always recording. He sat in the cab with the engine idling and pulled the clip up on his phone, headlights washing the footage in that flat, colorless way dashcam footage always looked. like the world through a fish tank. He watched his own swerve happen, the wheel cutting hard, the trailer's shadow lurching in the mirror insert at the corner of the frame, and he watched the road the whole time it happened, waiting for her to come up in the high beams, the way she had in real life. The road was empty. The whole 11 seconds of it. Wet asphalt, his own headlights, rain falling through the beam like static, and then his truck, jerking sideways across both lanes, for no reason a camera could find. He watched it 4 more times. He slowed it down frame by frame on the shoulder there, engine still running, and there wasn't a blur, wasn't a shape at the tree line, wasn't so much as a deer, just a truck swerving itself nearly into a ditch on a straight stretch of empty highway, and a driver who knew, personally, with his whole chest, that it hadn't been empty at all. He didn't tell dispatch. He didn't tell his wife when he got home 2 days later either, because he could hear how it would sound coming out of his mouth, and he didn't want to watch her face while she decided whether to be worried about the ghost or worried about him. He told himself it was fatigue and left it there, the way you leave a splinter that's too deep to dig out cleanly. And he kept driving Highway 12 twice a week like he always had, because the Cedar didn't care what he'd seen, and neither did the mill in Morton. The call from the terminal came about 3 weeks after that, and it wasn't about his clip at all. His safety manager, a heavy-set woman named Carol, who'd been doing the job longer than Dell had been driving, sat him down in her office with a laptop open and told him the state patrol had forwarded a complaint. A woman driving home from her shift at the hospital in Morton said a loaded log truck had come across the center line at her on Highway 12 near the old mill turnoff, forced her onto the shoulder, nearly put her in the ditch, didn't even slow down after. She'd gotten the company name off the trailer and called it in. Her own dash cam had caught it. Carol played the clip. Dell watched his own truck, from the outside this time, from a stranger's windshield, come around that bend and swerve hard across both lanes, like something had shoved it, correct, and keep going. The road ahead of his truck, in her footage same as his, was empty the whole time. No deer, no debris, no woman standing in the lane. Carol wanted to talk fatigue management, wanted him to sign something about mandatory rest breaks, and Dell signed it, because there wasn't anything else he could say that wouldn't get him pulled off the road for a psych eval. But he sat in his own truck afterward, in the terminal lot, and understood that something had shifted under him that couldn't be explained away with cold coffee anymore. 2 cameras, 2 systems that had never talked to each other, mounted on 2 different vehicles, had both watched the same empty road, and both watched his truck swerve on it, like it was dodging something neither camera could see. He started asking around after that, careful about it, framing it as road stories, the kind of thing drivers trade at 2 in the morning over gas station coffee to stay awake. Most of what he got back was nothing. Deer stories, black ice stories, one long rambling account about a driver who swore he'd seen a cougar the size of a Buick. But an old-timer named Hoyt, who'd been running that stretch of 12 since before Dell had his license, said it without much weight to it, like it was old news gone soft with retelling. Guys used to talk about a woman on that bend by the mill turnoff, years back. Said she'd wave you down like she needed a ride, and then she wasn't there when you stopped. Hoyt hadn't seen her himself. Figured it was the kind of story that gets passed around a route until everybody's heard a version of it, and nobody remembers whose it was first. Dell didn't sleep well after that conversation, and 2 nights later, off the clock, sitting at his kitchen table with his wife asleep upstairs, he did what he probably should have done from the start, and searched the name of the town, along with the words truck and accident and that stretch of highway. It took him 40 minutes of dead ends before he found the article, scanned from a local paper that had folded years back, archived on some county historical society's website that hadn't been updated since the layout still used table borders. A woman named Carrie Ann Fowler, 26, had been walking the shoulder near the old mill turnoff on Highway 12 late one November night, and she'd been struck and killed by a commercial vehicle that didn't stop. No witnesses, no arrest, ever. The case had gone cold within a year and stayed that way. There was a photo, grainy, newsprint gray, of a young woman with her arms crossed, unsmiling, and Dell looked at it longer than he meant to, before he made himself look away. That would have been enough on its own, to sit with him for a long time. What he found, in a follow-up article, printed 8 months after the first, was the thing that actually took the floor out from under him. Investigators had recovered paint transfer from Fowler's clothing, along with a fragment of trailer trim, and matched the color and finish to a hauler that had operated across 3 counties in that era, before going under in a bankruptcy a couple years later, a company whose logo, described in the article as a green pine tree over crossed white lines, had never been definitively tied to a specific truck or driver. The case notes, quoted secondhand from a retired trooper, mentioned that the fleet's remaining equipment had been liquidated at auction after the company folded, scattered to buyers across the state, untraceable after that. Dell sat with his coffee going cold and thought about the paint job on Unit 214, the truck he'd been driving for going on 14 months, bought secondhand at a fleet auction before he was ever assigned to it. He thought about the faded green ghost of a logo you could still see under the current paint if the light hit the door panel right on a sunny day, a shape nobody at the company had ever bothered to explain because nobody had ever asked. He'd assumed it was just old signage, primer bleeding through. He went out to the driveway at 1 in the morning in his socks and looked at it anyway, running his thumb over the panel like it might tell him something, and in the wash of his phone light, he could just make out, under 14 years of repaints, the shape of a pine tree over 2 crossed lines. It wasn't the road. He understood that now, sitting on his own porch steps at 1:30 in the morning, with his feet going numb in the cold. It had never been the road. It was the truck. Whatever had happened to Carrie Ann Fowler had happened to whatever driver was sitting behind that windshield, on that stretch, at whatever hour it chose, and the truck had been sold and repainted and reassigned for over a decade, running other routes, until somebody at the company put it back on Highway 12 and handed the keys to Del Hobart. He put in for a truck swap the next morning, told the shop foreman the transmission on 214 felt soft on the mountain grades, which wasn't even a lie exactly, because his hands had started feeling soft on that wheel too, uncertain, like the whole vehicle had gone unfamiliar under him. Fleet was short 2 trucks that month for routine maintenance, and the foreman told him it'd be at least another week before anything opened up, so Del kept driving 214 on Highway 12 4 more nights, and every one of those nights, he watched that bend by the old mill turnoff coming up in his headlights and felt his whole body brace before he even reached it. On the last of those nights, she was there again. Same spot, same stillness, arms at her sides, close enough in the brights that he could see the collar of a coat that didn't match any decade he could place. His hands wanted to do what they'd done the first time. He held the wheel straight instead, forced himself to, foot easing off the gas but not slamming the brake, easing through it the way you're taught to ease through a deer you can't avoid, because 42,000 pounds of cedar swerving on a wet mountain road had nearly put him in a ditch once already, and he'd rather find out what was true than die finding out. He drove straight through the spot where she was standing. There was no impact, no sound. When he checked his mirror a half-second later, the bend behind him was just wet asphalt and taillights and rain, same as it had ever been on any ordinary night on Highway 12. His phone buzzed before he'd gone another quarter mile, the event recorder flagging something, a hard input on the wheel it had picked up even though he swore he'd held it steady, uploading a clip to the app and to Carol's inbox the way it always did. Del didn't pull over to watch it. He didn't watch it that night, or the next morning, or the week after, when the swap finally came through and he handed 214's keys back to the dispatcher and picked up a different set for a truck with no ghost of a logo under its paint that he knew of. He deleted the app off his phone eventually, told himself it was just clutter, and when Carol asked once, offhand, if he still reviewed his safety clips like the company liked drivers to do, he said sure, mostly, same as anybody. He heard, secondhand, from another driver at a truck stop outside Chehalis about 4 months later, that the new kid running 214 now, 19, maybe 20, first year out of trucking school, had been asking around at that same truck stop about a woman he swore he'd seen standing in his lane, out past Packwood, gone by the time he stopped. The other driver told it like a joke, the way Hoyt had told it to Del, like a story that gets handed down a route until it belongs to everybody and nobody at once. Del didn't laugh. He didn't correct him either. He sat there with his coffee and thought about saying something, about the paint, about the article, about the 14 years the truck had spent driving clean before somebody put it back on that road. And then he thought about how it would sound coming out of his mouth to a stranger in a truck stop diner, and he didn't say any of it. He got back in his own truck that night, a different unit now, clean history as far as he knew. And when the little green light on his dash blinked to tell him the event recorder was working fine, recording like it always did, he reached up without really deciding to, and turned his phone face down on the seat beside him, screen dark, and didn't look at it again the rest of the drive. The dispatch call came in a little after 6 that morning, and Roy Kessler almost didn't take it. It was a one-off delivery, cash account, no phone number on file, just coordinates that dropped him somewhere deep inside the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, past the last gas station in Randall, past the last cell tower anybody bothered to check. The paperwork listed the customer as Cedar Fork Logging, a standing account that had been on Cowlitz River Freight's books since before Roy was hired. Dispatch told him it paid on delivery, always had, and that the account manager, a woman named Sherry who'd worked the desk for 11 years, just shrugged when he asked about it. "Some of these old logging outfits don't believe in phones," she said. "You'll get there. They'll sign. You'll leave. Simple." The drive-in took longer than the map promised. Pavement gave out to gravel. Gravel gave out to a rutted 2-track that hadn't seen a grader in a long while. And somewhere past mile 11, his phone lost signal entirely. The little bars just gone. No warning. Like the forest had reached out and switched something off. He kept driving because turning around on a road that narrow, with a drop on one side thick with hemlock and vine maple, felt like the worst option. Fog sat low in the draws between the ridgelines, not thick enough to blind him, just enough to blur the tree line into something soft at the edges. He checked his odometer against the delivery sheet twice, sure he'd missed a turn, and both times the numbers matched up fine. That was the strange part he didn't think much of yet. Everything matched. It just didn't feel like it should have taken that long to get there. The camp sat in a clearing that opened up sudden, or the road. Log bunkhouses, with cedar shake roofs. A mess hall, with a tin stovepipe chimney breathing wood smoke into the gray morning. A corral, holding 2 draft horses, that stamped and blew when his engine noise carried down the slope. Men were working near a rack of crosscut saws and steel cable, maybe a dozen of them, in wool coats and canvas trousers. And Roy noted, in the distant way you note things that don't quite fit, that there wasn't a single chainsaw in sight, not a single truck besides his own. No generator hum, nothing. He figured it for one of those heritage operations, the kind that logged selectively with horses for insurance reasons, or some conservation grant, PR stuff. It made a kind of sense. He'd delivered to stranger places. A big man with a gray beard and a scar shaped like a fishhook over one eyebrow came down to meet him, hand out, before Roy had even finished setting the brake. "Emmett Voss," he said, camp foreman, and thanked him for making the drive. Said the boys had been waiting on that cable for a week. He had the kind of handshake that meant it, dry and hard. And behind him the crew had already started drifting over, curious in the unhurried way of men who didn't see new faces often. They asked him about the drive, about gas prices, about whether the Mariners were any good this year, and Roy answered easy, glad for the company after 2 hours alone on a bad road. They fed him in the mess hall, beans and salt pork, and coffee that tasted like it had been on the stove since sunup. And it was good, plain food. And for a while the whole thing felt like exactly what it looked like. Just a crew of men who lived rough and worked hard, and didn't get much company. It was somewhere in that meal, trying to make conversation, that he mentioned the date. Somebody asked him what day it was, casual as anything, and he told them, the 22nd of July, and then, because the older man across from him looked doubtful, he added the year, without thinking twice about it. The mess hall went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Fork stopped. A man near the stove set his cup down slow, like he didn't trust his hand not to drop it. Emmett's face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did, and he said, flat, that Roy had that wrong. Must be misremembering. And Roy laughed a little and said he was pretty sure he'd signed a dozen forms that morning with that date on them. Nobody laughed back. The moment passed, the way an awkward moment does when everybody agrees, without saying so, to let it pass. And the talk picked back up about cable tension and the grade of the North Slope. But it had a different shape to it now, careful, like men stepping around something on the floor they didn't want to look at directly. Roy figured they'd been out here long enough to lose track. It happened, he told himself. Men who didn't see a calendar from one month to the next. They wouldn't let him leave once the meal was done. Emmett said the grade coming down off the ridge washed out bad in low light. No guardrail worth the name, and that he'd be a fool to try it in the dark, with a full day's drive already in his legs. It was true enough. Roy had felt the road shifting under his tires on the way in, and his phone was dead weight in his pocket anyway. No signal to call anybody who'd worry. They set him up in a spare bunk at the end of one of the log houses and told him he'd have breakfast and be on his way at first light. He stepped out before turning in, just to breathe air that didn't smell like wood smoke and wet wool for a minute. And that was when he saw the board mounted near the office door. A hand-carved plank with names burned into it. A crew roster maybe, or a memorial. He couldn't tell in the low light. One name caught something in the back of his mind. A name he'd read that morning, on a rusted marker, bolted to a boulder, at a trailhead he'd passed on the way in. A plaque he'd barely glanced at, because he was running behind schedule. In memory of the men lost in the Cedar Fork campfire. He hadn't read the date on it. He wished now he had. He told himself it was a common enough name for a logging family in this part of the state. Told himself descendants probably ran the outfit now and kept the old board up out of respect. And he went to bed on that thin reasoning, because it was easier than the alternative. Sleep didn't come easy, so he went looking for the camp's radio, thinking he could at least raise dispatch and let them know he'd be a night late. What they had was an old hand crank set in the office, tubes glowing amber when Emmett cranked it for him, apologetic, saying it was the only set that worked out here. What came through wasn't dispatch. It was a broadcast, faint under the static. A man's voice reading off a ballgame score Roy half remembered from somewhere. A score that belonged to a season that had ended a long time ago, and a weather report for a storm system, with a name he was sure he'd heard his father mention once, years back, in a story about a bad winter. Emmett clicked it off before Roy could listen close enough to be sure of anything. Said the set only picked up an old recording loop they kept for the noise of it, company on quiet nights. Roy nodded like that made sense. He wasn't sure it did. It was the photograph that finally cracked the reasoning he'd been building all evening. It hung behind the office desk, the whole crew posed stiff in front of the mess hall, a date scrawled in the corner in fountain pen ink. 40 years back near enough. He almost didn't look twice, but something about the man standing dead center pulled his eye, and he stepped closer, and his stomach dropped in a way that had nothing dramatic about it, just a plain cold drop, because the face looking back out of that old photograph had a fishhook scar over the left eyebrow and a gap between the front teeth wide enough to whistle through, and it was Emmett, not a father, not a grandfather with a family resemblance, the same man, unaged, down to the crease at the corner of his mouth. Roy didn't sleep after that. He waited until the bunkhouse had gone quiet with breathing, and he took his keys and walked out to the van as easy and unremarkable as he could make himself move, and he drove. The road he was sure he'd come in on curved the way he remembered, switchback after switchback down through the fog, and he drove it with his headlights carving a tunnel through the dark, and his hands sweating on the wheel. And after 20 minutes of driving, he came around a bend, and there was the camp again, the mess hall chimney still breathing smoke into the black, a couple of the men standing near the gate like they'd been waiting, not surprised to see him. He backed up and tried a different fork he hadn't noticed before, drove it as far as it went, and it brought him back the same way. Gate, chimney, men standing easy in the dark like this was routine to them, like they'd seen it plenty of times before. Emmett walked out to his window, not unkind, something almost sorry in his face, and he said that every year somebody made the trip, and every year the road brought them back the same way, no matter which fork they tried, until they stopped trying. He held up an old ledger, leather cover soft and dark with handling, and opened it to a page near the back, rows of dates and signatures going back further than Roy wanted to count, and near the bottom, dated a year to the day before this one, was a signature in handwriting Roy knew as well as his own face in a mirror, because it was his own, his full name, his particular slant on the K in Kessler that he'd had since grade school, on a line for a delivery he had never made, for a route he had never driven before that morning. He came to somewhere around dawn, slumped over his own wheel, with the engine cold and the windows fogged, parked at the edge of a clearing that held nothing but old foundation stones, gone soft with moss, a cellar hole grown over with salal, a scatter of rusted cans, and a scrap of listing fence, with small iron markers, half swallowed in the undergrowth, too many of them to count from where he sat. The road out behaved itself this time. Ordinary switchbacks, ordinary washouts, and by the time he hit pavement, his phone had 3 bars and a string of missed calls from dispatch. Sherry didn't ask many questions when he got back, just told him the account showed paid in full, already logged before he'd even radioed in, and when he asked to see the slip, she pulled it from the folder and set it in front of him, his own signature on the line, the ink gone the soft brown of paper much older than a single night could account for, the edges of it worn the way paper wears from being handled over years, not hours. She didn't seem to notice anything strange about it. She just filed it back where it belonged, glanced at the account notes, and said, without looking up, that Cedar Fork always came through the same week every summer, always wanted the same driver once they'd had him, and that she'd go ahead and put him down for it again next July, if that was fine by him. People ask me how you keep going after something like this, and the honest answer is, you don't, not really. You just learn how to carry it while you walk. My name is Mark. My wife Renee drove long haul for 11 years, the last 6 of them solo, pulling flatbeds and reefers through the mountains up in Northeast Washington. We met at a diner off I-90, back when I still had hair worth combing, and we got married in her parents' backyard, with a keg balanced on a lawnmower trailer. 16 years. She had a handle on the CB, Blue Wren, because she said truckers were the only ones who ever really listened to her talk. She ran a regular route that fall, hauling for a small outfit out of Spokane, up through Kettle Falls and over Sherman Pass on Highway 20, right through Colville National Forest, delivering to a lumber yard outside Republic. She'd done that stretch probably 400 times. We had a ritual. She'd call me from the top of the pass, right where her phone caught 1 bar of signal before dropping into the dead zone on the other side, and she'd say, "Clearing the pass, call you from town." Every single run. It was so routine I stopped even thinking of it as a thing we did. It was just Tuesday. That Tuesday, she didn't call from town. I didn't panic right away, because you don't, not at first. Truckers lose signal. Trucks break down. Sometimes she'd stop for a shower and forget her phone was even charged. By 9 that night, I'd called her 4 times and gotten nothing but the ring. By midnight, I called her dispatcher. By 6 the next morning, I was standing in my kitchen, looking at a voicemail she'd left me at 4:52 the previous afternoon. One I hadn't even noticed come in, because I'd been out mowing and left my phone on the porch like an idiot. 11 seconds long. I've listened to it so many times I could draw you a picture of the silence. It opens with wind, or what sounds like wind, and then breathing, quick and shallow, the kind of breathing you do when you're moving fast, or trying very hard not to make noise. And right at the end, right before it cuts, there's a whisper, 1 word. For a year I was sure it was sorry. I built an entire second life around that word. I decided she was apologizing to me for something, maybe for leaving, maybe for dying, maybe just for the argument we'd had that morning about whether she needed new brake pads before the trip. I carried that word like it was scripture. The Ferry County Sheriff's Office found her rig 11 hours after that voicemail came in, parked at a pull-off 2 miles east of the pass summit, engine off, doors locked from the inside, keys still in the ignition. Her thermos was in the cup holder, still faintly warm according to the trooper who found it, which meant she hadn't been gone from that cab for very long when he got there. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her lunch was half eaten. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, nothing knocked over, nothing broken. It looked, the trooper told me later, like she'd just stepped out to check a tire and never come back. For 2 days, that's what everyone believed. that she'd wandered off the road for some reason and gotten lost or hurt in the timber. Search and rescue, brought in dogs, brought in a helicopter, walked grid patterns through brush so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of your own boots. And then something came back from her carrier's tracking system that didn't fit the story at all. Her personal cell phone, separate from the company's satellite unit bolted to the dash, had pinged a tower almost 30 miles from that pull-off, 4 hours after the time on my voicemail, which meant that whatever happened to her at that truck, she hadn't stayed there. Something, or someone, had moved. That single data point turned the investigation upside down. It stopped being a search for a woman who'd wandered off a logging road and became something else, something colder and more deliberate, because phones don't walk themselves 30 miles through national forest. The next piece came from the truck itself. Her electronic logging device, the little black box every commercial rig carries now, showed the engine had been idling at that exact pull-off for 41 minutes before my voicemail went out. 41 minutes she wasn't moving, wasn't logging miles, wasn't doing anything the system could account for. And when investigators pulled satellite weather imagery for the corridor, cross-referenced against a dash cam another driver handed over 3 weeks later, there it was, grainy and half-obscured by trees. A second vehicle, a pickup, pulled in behind her rig sometime during that window. No plate visible. Gone by the time troopers arrived. I stopped sleeping around then. I want to be honest about that, because I think people watching stories like this from the outside imagine grief as something quiet, and it isn't. It's frantic. I started going through everything of hers I could get my hands on, not because I thought I'd find something the police missed, but because sitting still felt like betrayal. That's how I found the bank statements. Cash withdrawals, $300 and $400 at a time, going back almost 2 months, money that never showed up in anything I recognized, and buried in a folder of old receipts, a storage unit lease, out of a place in Colville, under her maiden name. 14 years married, and I didn't know she had a storage unit, 40 minutes from a route she drove every week. I'll admit what I thought when I found that lease. I thought the worst thing a husband can think. I drove out there the same afternoon with the spare key from her key ring, expecting to find proof of some other life, some other man, some door I'd never known was in our marriage. What I found instead was a banker's box of spiral notebooks and a second phone, a cheap prepaid one, dead, tucked inside a rolled-up flannel shirt. The notebooks weren't love letters. They were mile markers, dates, license plate fragments, descriptions of a white pickup with a camper shell she'd seen at 3 different rest stops over 4 months, and notes about a girl, maybe 14, maybe younger, she'd seen twice at the same truck stop outside Kettle Falls, once looking, in Renee's words, wrong in the eyes, like she wasn't there, even when she was standing right there. My wife hadn't been hiding an affair. She'd been running her own quiet investigation, the kind long-haul drivers get trained to watch for now, the kind they call into hotlines because they're the only ones who drive the same stretch of highway enough times to notice when something's off. When I got that burner phone charged, the call log confirmed it. 10 days before she disappeared, she'd called the National Human Trafficking Hotline and stayed on the line for 6 minutes. There was a draft text saved on the phone, never sent, describing the truck, the plate fragment, the location, and the girl. I handed all of it to the sheriff's office myself, sat in a room while a detective read through 60 pages of my wife's handwriting and watched his face change from polite patience into something sharper. 2 weeks later, a waitress from the diner in Kettle Falls came forward after seeing Renee's photo rerun on the news. She remembered her, said she'd seen her outside in the parking lot 2 days before she vanished, having what looked like a quiet, tense conversation with a man near a white pickup. Renee's arms crossed, her whole body angled like she was ready to walk away from it. The waitress gave a description. That description, when it got cross-checked, matched a man already flagged, loosely, unofficially, in connection with 2 other disappearances along that same 40-mile stretch of highway over the previous 6 years. That should have been the break. In every version of this story I imagined in my head, that was supposed to be the break. Instead, it was the last real piece of movement the case ever had. No plate ever surfaced. No pickup was ever found. The man in the description was never named, because a second-hand memory of a stranger's face from a busy parking lot isn't enough to charge anyone with anything. The story ran on the local news for a few weeks. Then a national outlet picked it up for one segment. And then, the way these things always seem to go, the calls to the tip line slowed down, the search parties stopped forming on weekends, and my wife's name became a flyer, curling at the edges on a bulletin board outside a gas station on Highway 20. I kept driving that road myself. Every few weekends for the better part of a year, I'd load up flyers and drive the pass, stop at every pull-off, walk the tree line until my legs gave out. Not because I thought I'd find her, but because it felt like the only version of loving her I had left. Denny used to come with me sometimes. Denny Vance, her old dispatcher, a guy who'd known her since before I did, who'd been at our wedding, who showed up at my door with a casserole the second week she was gone, and just never really stopped showing up. He drove me to search sites when I was too wrecked to trust myself behind the wheel. He sat with me on the anniversary. I don't know what I would have done that year without him. About 13 months after she disappeared, a padded envelope showed up at my house, with no return address, postmarked from a post office in Republic, less than an hour from where her truck was found. Inside, wrapped in a paper towel, was her wedding ring, still threaded onto the thin silver chain she used to wear it on when she drove, because the ring itself never fit right over her work gloves. No note, nothing else. I called the sheriff's office and they logged it, dusted it, ran it, and got nothing usable off an envelope that had been through half a dozen hands in the postal system. But somebody out there had that ring for over a year and chose, for reasons I will never understand, to send it to me. I want to tell you the story ends there, with some kind of answer, but it doesn't, and I've had to make peace with the fact that it might never. What I can tell you is what happened a few months ago, because it's the reason I'm sitting here talking to you at all. There's a woman online, does audio forensics as a hobby, cleans up bad 911 calls and old dashcam audio for cold case pages. She reached out after seeing Renee's case mentioned in a forum, offered to run my original voicemail through some software I don't fully understand and don't need to. It took her about 6 weeks. When she sent it back, she'd pulled the noise floor down and isolated 2 layers I never knew were in there. Under the wind, under Renee's breathing, there's a second sound, low and steady, that the analyst says is consistent with a diesel engine idling close by. Not the sound of a truck parked and shut off, an engine running. And the whisper, the word I'd built a year of guilt around, the word I was sure for so long was sorry. It isn't. Slowed down, cleaned up, it's 2 syllables, not 1, and the shape of it isn't an apology at all. It's a name. It's Denny's name. I haven't done anything with that yet. I don't know what there is to do with it. A recovered whisper on a bad phone call isn't evidence of anything a court would look at twice. The analyst told me that herself. Straight out. No false hope attached. It could be a coincidence of sound. It could be static, shaped like a name, because I wanted it to be. But I know what I heard, and I know who was standing next to me at her graveside marker, with no body under it, who has had dinner at my table every month for over a year, who I let drive me to look for her. I don't have an ending for you. The sheriff's office still has the file open, technically, the way these things stay open forever, without ever really moving. Nobody's been arrested. Nobody's even been named out loud. I still drive the pass sometimes, alone now, and I still don't know if the word she whispered was a warning, or an accusation, or just the last thing her mind reached for while she was scared. All I know is that somewhere out past Sherman Pass, in that stretch of trees that swallowed my wife whole, the truth is still parked at some pull-off with its engine running, and I have spent every day since learning how to live next to a question that is never going to answer back. The passenger seat. I've told this story maybe 6 times in 22 years of driving, and every time I leave something out, not because I forget it, but because some things sound smaller out loud than they felt at 2 in the morning on a mountain grade. So I'm going to give you the whole thing this time, straight through, the way it actually happened. I was hauling cherries that summer, Yakima to the Seattle terminal, a reefer trailer keeping 40 pounds of fruit at 34 degrees the whole way over Chinook Pass, State Route 410, through the Cascades. The kind of road that climbs in switchbacks with a drop on one side and rock on the other, and no cell service for the better part of 40 miles once you're up in it. Dispatch had me running tight that week because the harvest was early and the buyer in Seattle didn't care about my hours of service, only about cherries on a truck by 6 a.m. I'd been up since 3 the day before. I knew I was cutting it close on my 14-hour clock, so I pulled into a gravel turnout past Greenwater, cracked the window for air, set an alarm on my phone for 20 minutes, and let my head go back against the seat. When I opened my eyes, the truck was moving, not idling, not rolling to a stop, moving, doing about 50 on a curve I didn't remember choosing to take, and my hands were on the wheel, like they'd been there the whole time. I had no memory of starting the engine, releasing the brake, or pulling back onto the highway. That gap, right there, that's the first thing that still bothers me, more than anything that came after. Because whatever a person is, when they're not quite awake and not quite asleep, that's not what was driving that truck. Something was sitting in it that knew how to keep a rig on a mountain road, and it wasn't fully me. And there was somebody in the passenger seat. I want to be clear that I never got a good look, and even now, all these years later, if you asked me to describe a face or clothes or anything like that, I couldn't do it. And it's not because I'm holding back. It's because I never let my eyes land on it directly. Not that first night. Not for a long time after. All I can tell you is the shape of it, in the corner of my vision, sitting upright, still, facing forward, watching the road, the way a driver watches a road, like it had somewhere to be too. I didn't scream. I want that on the record, because in the version of this story I tell at truck stops, people always expect that part, and it never happened. What I did was reach for the CB, more out of habit than anything, just to hear another human voice on Channel 19 and pretend the world was normal. Before I could even key the mic, a voice came through. Some driver headed the other direction, saying something to a partner about the grade being bad tonight. And then, clear as anything, he said, "Tell your passenger to keep an eye out for elk past mile 60. Nobody had said a word to him about a passenger. I hadn't said anything on the radio at all. That's the part where the whole shape of the night changed for me, because up until then I could have told myself I was dreaming, or hallucinating from exhaustion, something that started and ended with me. That one sentence told me other people on that road had used that exact word before, for exactly what I had sitting next to me. I looked at the dash clock next, and that's when the second floor dropped out from under me. My alarm had been set for 20 minutes. 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed. I hadn't just dozed off for a beat behind the wheel. I had lost the better part of 3 hours of my life, and somewhere in that gap the truck had gotten moving, found the highway, and made it around at least a dozen curves clean. I checked the mirror to look at the passenger without looking at the passenger, if that makes sense, using the angle of the glass instead of turning my head, and I saw that the seatbelt was buckled across it. Not twisted, not loose, buckled the ordinary way a person buckles a belt when they've done it 1,000 times. That detail undid me more than almost anything else that night. It meant whatever this was hadn't just appeared in a rush and dropped into the seat. It had settled in. It had made itself comfortable in a way that suggested routine, like this wasn't its first ride, only my first time noticing. I thought about pulling over right then. I want you to understand how strong that instinct was, to stop the truck on the shoulder and get out and just run. But my company had put inward-facing cameras in every cab that year, the kind that record and flag things automatically. And some old, practical part of my brain said, if something happens to me on this road tonight, I want a witness that isn't just my own shaking voice. So instead of stopping, I kept driving, hands steady, eyes on the yellow line, telling myself that as long as the camera was rolling, I wasn't as alone as I felt. Somewhere past the summit, heading down the east side toward Notches, one bar of signal finally crawled onto my phone, and it lit up all at once with missed calls and texts, 20-some of them, all from my wife, all stacked up in that same lost window of time. Our daughter Emma had been in a fender bender on the way home from practice. Nothing life-threatening, but she'd been shaken up and asking for me. And my wife had been trying to reach me for almost 3 hours, while I was unreachable in the mountains, with something sitting in my passenger seat wearing my missing time, like a coat. That's when the fear stopped being about ghosts on a highway and became something worse. The fear of not being where you're needed when it matters, which is a fear every driver who's ever missed a birthday or a school play already carries around anyway. I pulled into a truck stop in Natchez to call her back and fuel up, hands still not fully steady. And while I was standing at the pump, another driver from a lumber outfit came over for a cigarette and small talk, the way we do. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a rig had gone off the grade back up near Cayuse that same night. Driver named Kurt Palmer, dead at the scene, hauling logs for a company out of Enumclaw. Same road, same hours. My blood went cold standing there in the diesel smell, because for the first time, the thing sitting in my truck wasn't just strange. It was sitting on a road where somebody had actually died that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling those two facts belonged in the same sentence. It took almost a week before I found out how close those two facts really were. My safety manager called me into his office because the AI system on the inward camera had flagged a hard steering event at 11:38 that night, right around the same mile marker, and almost the same minute, Kurt Palmer's truck had gone off the road further up the grade. The footage showed me slumped, clearly unconscious, and then, without any visible reason, my hands moving on their own, correcting the wheel hard around a bend like I was avoiding something crossing the beam of my headlights, something the low light never quite caught. What the footage did not show was anybody in the passenger seat. As far as that camera was concerned, I had been alone in that cab the entire time. My manager chalked it up to a fatigue-related microsleep, gave me a write-up, and told me to get more rest between loads. I didn't argue. What was I going to say? What I didn't tell him, and what took me longer to admit to myself, is that 8 years before that night, on that exact stretch of 410, I'd rolled a trailer on black ice in October, with my younger brother Danny riding beside me, teaching him the trade the way our dad had taught me. Danny didn't walk away from that wreck. I did. I hadn't driven 410 once in the 8 years since. Not for any load, not for any bonus. Until that cherry season, when the extra miles paid enough to cover a surgery Emma needed on her knee that our insurance wouldn't fully carry. I told myself the money was worth going back to the one road I'd sworn I was done with. I didn't let myself think too hard about what else might still be waiting up there. A few weeks later, running that same lane again, sleep debt caught up with me in the exact same gravel turnout, because some mountains only give you one place to pull off safely, whether you like the memory attached to it or not. When I woke up and felt that same stillness beside me, I did something I hadn't let myself do the first time. I turned my head. I still didn't see a face. I want to be honest about that. My eyes just wouldn't hold there the way eyes hold on an ordinary person. But in that half second, I caught the smell of wintergreen chewing tobacco, the same brand Danny always kept a tin of in his jacket pocket, and I caught the set of a pair of shoulders, relaxed and square, in a way I would know anywhere, in a crowd, in the dark, at the end of my life. I didn't need a face. My chest already knew. Now here's the part I haven't gotten to yet in any of the other times I've told this, which is that I'm not telling it to you from some barstool years later. I'm telling it right now, tonight, on 410, to a kid named Cole sitting in my passenger seat, 22 years old, 3 weeks into his training run with me, because he asked why I always take my 30-minute break in that one turnout past Greenwater and never anywhere else on this lane. I've been talking for the last 10 minutes with my eyes on the road, and Cole hasn't said a word the whole time, which for a talkative kid like him is its own kind of answer. When I finally glance over to see how badly I've spooked him, he isn't looking at me. He's looking straight out the windshield, quiet in a way that isn't fear, more like recognition, and he says, real low, that back, before he came to this outfit he drove for a company running I-70 through Colorado, and one night on Vail Pass, dead tired, past his hours, he'd felt the exact same thing settle in beside him, watching the road like it had somewhere it needed him to get to. He'd never told anybody either, figuring nobody would believe a 20-year-old kid over black coffee and bad sleep. Hearing him say it out loud, in my truck, on my road, about his own mountain 1,000 miles away, told me something I hadn't let myself consider before, that whatever this is, It isn't tied to one grade or one grief. It rides with whoever's about to go too far past the edge of what a tired body can survive, wherever that edge happens to be that night. We didn't talk much after that, just drove. The Jake brake growling on the downgrades, the dash lights the only color for miles. Before I let myself get sleepy again, when I felt that stillness settle in beside me one more time the way it does most nights on this stretch now, I did something I never had the nerve to do those first years. I said thank you, quiet, just under the engine noise. Not sure if it was for Danny, or for whatever keeps a truck on the road when the driver can't anymore, or for both. The seat beside me was empty by the time Cole looked over to see what I'd said it to. I didn't explain. Some things you only get to understand by staying awake long enough to feel them leave. I've been driving trucks for 22 years. 22 years, 4 million miles, and I thought I'd seen every version of strange this job could throw at me. Deer in the road, ice on the grapevine, a bear going through my cooler at a rest stop outside Reading. But nothing like this. Nothing that still keeps me up some nights, doing the math over and over, trying to make the numbers add up in a way that lets me sleep. It was a Tuesday night, middle of October, running north on I-5, through that long stretch of nothing between Weed and the Oregon border. That part of the state, you know it if you've driven it. Pine trees, dark mountains, maybe one gas station light for 50 miles. I've run that stretch probably 800 times in my career. I could draw you the curves of that road with my eyes closed. Every pull-off, every runaway truck ramp, every spot where the cell signal drops out for exactly 6 minutes. So when I came around the bend past the Bailey Hill exit and saw lights up ahead, floodlights, the kind that wash out everything in that flat white glare, my first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion, because there is no scale house on that stretch. Never has been. I checked my pro miles later that same week, just to be sure I wasn't losing my mind, and it confirmed what I already knew. Nearest official station's almost 60 miles south, but there it was, a low building, chain link fence, one of those orange and white arm gates, coming down across both lanes, and a man in uniform standing under the lights, waving me in, with one of those lit wands, like he'd been standing there, waiting on me, specifically. Now, when you've got a Smokey waving you in, you don't argue. You signal, you slow, you roll onto the scale. I remember the tires crunching over gravel that felt too fresh, too clean, like it had been laid down recently, and nobody had driven on it much. I remember thinking, they must be finishing construction on this thing. This must be new, and that thought satisfied me for about 4 minutes, which is exactly how long it took for things to start feeling wrong. He came around to my window, and the first thing he said wasn't evening or how's the load riding. It was my name, not off my DOT number stenciled on the door. He said it before I'd even rolled the window all the way down, like he already had a file open on me somewhere. Then he smiled, real easy, real practiced, and asked to see my logbook. I handed it over, figuring standard stuff, and that's when it got strange, in a way I couldn't put my finger on yet. He wasn't checking my hours. He was flipping backward, weeks backward, running his finger down entries from a run I'd made almost a month prior, a load I'd hauled out of Stockton, refrigerated produce, nothing special. He asked me who I'd been hauling for that week, asked how long I'd been with my current carrier, asked, and this is the part that still sits wrong in my stomach, whether my wife worked and how many kids we had. Like we were two guys getting to know each other at a bar and not standing on the shoulder of a federal highway at 11 at night. I answered, because that's what you do. You don't argue with a badge. He wrote something in my book, stamped it with a seal I'd never seen before, dark green ink, some kind of eagle design, and waved me on through like nothing had happened. Whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. I didn't think much more about it until 40-some miles later. Real way station this time. The one outside Grants Pass, that I've rolled through more times than I can count. Same routine, hand over the logbook, and the agent flips it open and just stops. Stares at the stamp, asks me where I got this. I told her, mile marker, description, the whole thing, and she looked at me the way you'd look at somebody telling you they saw a UFO. She said there's no scale house on that stretch. Never has been. Said the stamp wasn't any format DOT uses. Not state, not federal. Nothing she recognized in 11 years on the job. I laughed it off. Told her maybe it was a mobile unit, a temporary setup, and she just shrugged and sent me on. And I drove north not thinking much more about it. Because that's the thing about this job. Weird stuff happens, and you file it away, and you keep driving, because the freight doesn't care about your feelings. Where it stopped being something I could file away was about 6 weeks later, when my carrier's safety office called me in. Compliance review. Somebody had flagged an inconsistency in my hours for that October run. The log entry from the Phantom station didn't match anything in the ELD data, didn't match my GPS pings, and now there was a question mark hanging over my record that could mean points against my CSA score, could mean my insurance premium climbing, could mean, worst case, they start looking hard enough to find some other paperwork violation and pull my authority to drive for them. I sat in that office trying to explain a scale house that, as far as their systems were concerned, did not exist. And I had proof. I had the stamp, the ink, the date, written in my own handwriting. It didn't matter. On paper, I was a man who'd invented a location and lied about it in a federal logbook, and that is not a small thing in this industry. That's when I stopped letting it go. I started pulling up satellite images of that stretch of highway, going back through years of them. Nothing. Just gravel and weeds and a drainage culvert. No structure. Ever. Not even a foundation poured. I called the Department of Transportation, both state and federal. I called the California Highway Patrol. Nobody had any record of a way station ever being planned, permitted, or built at that mile marker. One woman on the phone with Caltrans actually laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Sir, we don't just put those up overnight." So I did what guys in this business do when the company won't listen and the agencies won't listen. I got on the boards, CB Chatter, trucker forums, a couple of private groups, on the messaging apps drivers use to swap intel on speed traps and construction, and I found I wasn't the only one. There was a guy running out of Fresno who described almost the identical thing on a stretch of 99 near Madera. Floodlights, gravel pull-off, that hadn't been there the week before. An officer who knew his name before he even asked. Another driver out of Bakersfield. Same story, different highway. All of them described the same thing. The inspection turning into something closer to an interview. Financial questions. Family questions. How new is your truck? Who's your insurance carrier? What's the policy limit on your cargo? That last detail is the one that stuck with me. Because when I went back through my own memory of that night, I remembered it too. He'd asked about my policy. At the time, I'd figured it for standard cargo verification. Now it felt like something else entirely. I started messaging back and forth with the guy from Fresno, comparing notes, trying to build some kind of pattern between us. And then one week, he just stopped answering. I found out 3 weeks later, from a mutual contact on one of those boards, that he'd been in a collision on the 99. Rear-ended a car that had allegedly brake-checked him in heavy traffic. 3 passengers inside, all of them claiming injuries, and the accident report had gone against him clean. Driver fault, full liability, and a payout working its way through his insurance that was going to follow him for the rest of his career. When I read that, something in my chest went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Because that's when it stopped feeling like a bureaucratic mix-up and started feeling like reconnaissance. I couldn't prove it. I still can't fully prove it. Not in the way you'd want if you were building a case in a courtroom. But you don't need a courtroom to feel the shape of something once you've seen it from enough angles. What I came to believe, and what a retired CHP investigator I eventually got on the phone more or less confirmed he'd heard whispers about, was that somewhere out there, somebody with real knowledge of how these systems work, badge design, inspection procedure, the specific language and rhythm of a roadside stop, had built a fake checkpoint whose entire purpose was to identify targets. High-value cargo, fresh equipment, big insurance policies. And once they had a name and a route and a schedule, the accident that followed wasn't an accident at all. It was staged, timed, and set up so the trucker's own paperwork, his own signed, stamped logbook, would make him look compliant and boring, right up until the moment fault got pinned entirely on him. I sat with that for a long time. And then, about 4 months after all this started, I got a call on my personal cell, a number that should not have had it, from a voice I didn't recognize, who referenced a detail from a private message thread I'd only ever discussed with 2 other drivers online. He didn't threaten me outright. He didn't have to. He just said I should be careful which forums I spent my time on, and hung up. I changed my number. I told my dispatcher I wasn't running that stretch of I-5 anymore. No explanation given, and thankfully none asked for. But 3 weeks after that call, running a totally different route down through the Central Valley, I picked up a sedan in my mirrors that stayed with me for almost 20 miles, matching my speed exactly, and then did something I recognized immediately from every warning I'd read on those boards. It swung in front of me, slowed hard, and held its brake lights just long enough to bait a reaction, then sped off, before I could tap my own brakes and end up on top of it. My hands were shaking on the wheel for an hour after. I didn't take the bait. I'd read enough by then to know not to. I pulled off at the next public rest area, one with cameras and other rigs parked and people around, and I sat there for 2 hours before I trusted myself to keep driving. I filed a report. I don't know what's come of it. Not really. These things move slow, and an 18-wheeler full of suspicion isn't exactly a smoking gun for anybody with a badge to act on fast. But a few months back, another driver, somebody I didn't know from a route up near Medford, got on one of those boards, asking if anyone had ever come across a way station that wasn't supposed to be there. Description matched. Floodlights, fresh gravel, an officer who already knew his name. I still run I-5. I still keep my paper log as backup, same as I always did. But now, every time I see lights up ahead on a stretch of road, I know better than my own driveway. I slow down a little more than the law requires, and I look twice before I ever let my foot come off the gas. My name doesn't matter much for this. What matters is the pass, and the 6 years I drove it hauling freight between the valley and the coast, and the one November morning that ended that part of my life for good. I want to start with the ordinary stuff, because that's what makes it hard to explain later. I knew that stretch of road the way you know the creak in your own staircase. 22 miles of switchbacks cut into the western slope of the Cascades, thick fir on both sides, guardrails rusted from 30 winters, a radio dead zone in the middle third, where even the CB got thin and staticky. I'd done that climb probably 400 times. I had a thermos I only used on that route. I had a spot, right before mile marker 14, where I always downshifted a beat early, because the grade kicked up without warning. Routine. Nothing about it felt like the kind of road you'd tell stories about. Except the drivers who worked it longer than me already were telling stories, and I just hadn't been listening close enough. The morning it happened, I pulled out of the yard around 4:40. Dark still, rain turning to sleet somewhere above 3,000 feet. Another driver, a guy named Rutger who ran the same corridor for a different outfit, came on the CB around mile 9, just shooting the breeze, the way you do when the silence gets long. We talked about his kid's basketball game, about a diner that changed owners and got worse. Normal trucker chatter, nothing special, except I remember it because of what came later. He signed off, saying he'd catch me on the other side, same as always. About 40 minutes after that, somewhere past the tree line where the switchbacks tighten up, I heard it. Not a sound exactly. That's the part I've never been able to explain right to insurance adjusters, or reporters, or even my own wife. It wasn't loud. It was low, underneath the engine noise, underneath the wipers, a pressure more than a noise. Like when a big truck passes you close on the highway, and your chest feels it before your ears do. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. I actually eased off the gas without deciding to, like my body knew something my head hadn't caught up to yet. That was the first turn, though I didn't know it yet, because 30 seconds later my CB crackled and it was another driver, someone I didn't recognize, voice tight, asking if anyone else just felt that. And before I could key up, a third voice, older, rougher, cut in and said, real quiet, that's the sound. That's the one they talk about. Then nothing. Just static, because we'd hit the dead zone. I want to be honest, I laughed it off in the cab. I've been driving that road a long time, and truckers love a good spooky story to kill the boredom. I figured it was wind shear through the canyon, some acoustic trick of the rock face. I kept driving. 90 seconds later, the whole hillside on my left came down. I didn't see it start. I felt the rig get shoved sideways, like something had put a shoulder into it, and then the windshield went brown, mud and rock, and shattered trees, all moving together, faster than anything that big has a right to move. I don't remember making the decision, but I cut the wheel hard right, into the guardrail, into the mountain wall on the other side, because it was the only direction the slide wasn't coming from. The trailer jackknifed. The cab spun maybe 180 degrees, and then everything stopped, and the whole world outside my window was just gray-brown sludge climbing the door panel, and my engine had stalled, and it was quiet in a way that felt worse than the noise had. I sat there for I don't know how long, mud packed against the glass on one side, before I understood I was going to live. The slide had buried the front half of the trailer and swallowed the lane I'd have been in 3 seconds later. If I'd kept my normal speed, if I hadn't eased off when I heard that hum, I'd have been another 20 feet forward when it hit. I would have been under it. That should have been the end of the story. Guy survives freak mudslide, thanks his lucky stars. Road gets fixed. Everybody moves on. That's what I thought too. Right up until I was sitting in the state patrol office 3 days later giving my statement, and the officer taking it down asked me, almost offhand, whether I'd heard anything unusual before the slide. I said the hum thing, feeling stupid saying it out loud in a fluorescent lit room, and he didn't write it down right away. He looked at his partner, and his partner said, "That's 4 now." That was the second turn, the one that actually scared me, because up until then, I'd assumed I was the story. Turns out, I was just the latest chapter. 4 other reports, going back 11 years, of drivers on that exact stretch describing the same low-pressure sound in the seconds before something went wrong. 2 of those 4 were slides like mine, survived, reported, filed away as unrelated freak weather events. The other 2 were vehicles that never made it to the other side of the pass at all. No wreckage found for months in one case. The driver's rig turned up the following spring, crushed almost flat, half a mile downslope from where anyone had been looking. I didn't sleep much after that. I started asking around at the yard, at truck stops, anywhere drivers who'd run that corridor for 20-30 years might be sitting over coffee. And that's when the folklore part came in, though nobody called it that. The old-timers didn't talk about ghosts. They talked about the mountain like it was something with a temperament. A couple of them said their fathers, guys who'd logged that slope back before the highway was even paved, wouldn't camp on that ridge past dark. Going back to warnings that predated the loggers too, from people who'd hunted that country long before any road existed. Nobody claimed to know why. It was just something you didn't do. The same way you don't walk under a ladder, except this one had a body count nobody had ever officially added up. Here's where it stopped being a story I could just be spooked by, and started being something I needed an answer to. I got in touch with a woman who used to work for the Forest Service, retired now, who'd spent part of her career doing slope stability surveys in that district. I expected her to tell me it was nothing, coincidence, the kind of pattern-seeking your brain does after trauma. Instead, she went quiet on the phone for a second, and then said there used to be a seismic monitoring station up on that ridge, decommissioned back in the 90s, when budget cuts hit. She still had some of the old data on a personal drive, because she'd never gotten around to deleting it. She sent it to me that night. I'm not a scientist, but even I could see the pattern in those readings once she walked me through it. Every documented slide event on that stretch, going back as far as the station had recorded, showed a spike of low-frequency ground vibration in the seconds before. Infrasound, she called it. Energy below what the human ear normally catches, except apparently under the right conditions, in the right kind of rock, people can feel it as pressure, or hear the edge of it as a hum. The station had picked up dozens of these spikes over the years that never led to a slide, but every slide had one first. Nobody had ever cross-referenced it because the station shut down before anyone thought to ask the question, and the reports of drivers hearing something got filed as folklore, not data. That alone would have been enough of a gut punch. But she had one more thing to tell me, and this was the turn that changed how I understood the whole thing. The vibration pattern didn't look natural to her. Not fully. She'd seen natural pre-slide seismic signatures before, and this had a rhythm to it that seemed off, almost regular. When she dug into old mining survey maps of that ridge, she found what she was looking for. There'd been shaft mining under that slope back in the early part of the last century, abandoned and sealed, never properly mapped for stability afterward. Decades of freeze-thaw and water infiltration had been hollowing out cavities under that hillside that nobody with any authority even knew existed anymore. Every slide wasn't some force with intention behind it. It was a mountain with a rotted skeleton underneath it, and every so often a section of that skeleton gave a little more, and the ground told you about it half a second before it happened, if you knew how to listen, which nobody officially did. That should have closed the loop for me. Explanation found, folklore demystified, tragedy understood. I could have let it end there. But the last turn is the one that still sits wrong in my chest, months later. I went back through the incident reports for the 2 drivers who'd never made it across. I wanted names, not statistics. And the second name on that list, the one from 4 years back, was Rutger's brother. Same last name, same hauling route, driving for the same company Rutger had worked for, before switching outfits. Rutger had never once mentioned it to me, in all our years of trading small talk on that CB channel. I called him after I found it, and he was quiet for a long time before he told me he stopped talking about his brother on that road a long time ago, because it was the only way he could keep driving it. He said he still keyed up every morning, half expecting to hear him answer. The pass closed for good about 6 weeks after my slide, once the follow-up survey confirmed what that retired surveyor already suspected, that there wasn't a fix that made sense financially or structurally, not with what was hollowed out underneath. They rerouted the freight corridor 40 minutes out of the way through the valley floor instead. There's a barricade up now where the old turnoff used to be, chain link and orange signage, and last I drove past it, somebody had zip-tied a small wooden cross to the fence. No name on it, just there. I don't run that stretch anymore, obviously. Nobody does. But every so often, usually on a long haul somewhere else entirely, engine humming under me in the dark, I catch myself listening for it anyway, not because I think it's out there waiting. I know now exactly what it was. The physics of it, the geology, the whole unglamorous explanation. But knowing what it is doesn't make you stop flinching when you hear something low and close underneath the road noise. It just means you understand, for about 4 seconds, exactly how much time you'd have left to do something about it. I've driven that stretch of Highway 20 through Colville and over Sherman Pass more times than I can count, and for 34 years, the mile markers never once did what they did that night. My name doesn't matter much here, but I'll give it anyway. Grady Pierce. I drive reefer freight for a cold storage outfit out of Spokane, mostly groceries, mostly nights, mostly alone, since my wife Carol passed. She used to ride shotgun on the long hauls back when the company still allowed it, and I kept the thermos she gave me clipped into the cup holder even though it dents the door panel a little. Her photos clipped to the visor. Small things. A man needs small things when the cab is the only room he lives in for 10 hours at a stretch. That night, I was running from the yard, up through Kettle Falls, over the pass, down into Republic, with a trailer full of frozen goods for 2 grocery stores that depend on me showing up on schedule, or their shelves go empty. I know that road the way I know the creases in my own palm. Mile marker 261 at the Kettle Falls Junction, 268, where the grade starts climbing, 279 at the Overlook, where I always slow down a little, just to look at the ridgeline, even in the dark, even when there's nothing to see but the shape of it, against a slightly less black sky. 289 at the summit. I could recite that stretch of numbers the way some men recite scripture. The first thing wrong was the radio. Normally on a weeknight there's some chatter, another driver running the same corridor, somebody complaining about ice on the Sherman Pass switchbacks, way station traffic down south. That night the CB gave me nothing but static, and I didn't think much of it until I noticed the static wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it. In, out, like something breathing through the speaker. I turned the squelch knob, thinking it was a bad connection, and the sound just adjusted itself to whatever I did, staying right at the edge of hearing. I turned the whole thing off after a while, told myself the antenna mount had finally rattled loose after 10 years of washboard roads. The second thing was the marker at what should have been 268. I caught it in my headlights for half a second, the way you always do, more habit than attention. It read 254. I remember laughing a little, out loud, alone in the cab, the way you laugh at your own mistake before you've fully clocked that it is one. I figured I'd misread it, or DOT had swapped in new posts and renumbered the corridor without telling anybody, which happens more than people think. I didn't turn around. I kept driving, but I started watching after that, really watching, the way I hadn't had to in 3 decades, because the numbers had never once needed watching. 253, 252, 251. They weren't skipping or doubling back. They were counting down, steady as a metronome, in the exact spots where the climbing numbers used to be. I checked my speedometer, 54 miles an hour, same as always on that grade. I checked my odometer against my dispatch sheet mileage, doing the math in my head the way you learn to after enough years, and the numbers weren't lining up either. I was covering more ground than the clock said I should be covering, like the miles themselves had gotten cheaper somehow, and my body didn't feel any of it. No fatigue, no change in the engine note, nothing physical to explain what the numbers were telling me. I picked the radio back up and put in a call to the yard, more out of a need to hear another human voice than any real hope dispatch could tell me something useful. Denise picked up. Night dispatcher. Been doing that job about as long as I've been driving for the company. I told her my mile markers were running backward on 20 and asked if maintenance had done something to the corridor. There was a pause on her end that went on a beat too long, and then she asked me, flat and a little confused, why I was calling in on a route we hadn't run since October. She said the Republic contract ended months back. I sat with that for a second, my own headlights the only light in any direction, and told her I was looking at the delivery order right there on my dash, printed that afternoon, and she said there was no order, nothing scheduled out of that yard for tonight at all. Then the connection went to static again, that same breathing static, and I set the mic down and didn't pick it back up. I decided the smart thing, the only thing, was to turn around, find the last place I knew was solid ground, and get back on it. I found a wide spot in the shoulder, cut the wheel, and took the truck back the way I'd come, watching close this time. But the guardrail that should have been on my right was on my left. There was no overpass where the county road usually crosses under 20, about 4 miles back, just open dark on both sides, where a concrete structure had stood my whole career. I drove another 10 minutes looking for the Kettle Falls Junction, the place I'd started from less than an hour before, and it wasn't there. The road behind me didn't match the road I remembered driving. I turned back around, because whatever this was, backward hadn't fixed it, and forward at least still felt like it was going somewhere. About the time I gave up on turning around, I passed the collapsed barn that sits just past the old Groden turnoff, half its roof caved in from some winter 20 years back, a landmark I've used to gauge my speed since before Carol and I got married. I clocked the marker next to it. Then, maybe 15 minutes later, doing the same speed on what looked like the same grade, I passed it again. Same collapsed roofline, same angle of the fence post leaning into the ditch, except the mile marker beside it read a different number than it had the first time, lower, like the barn had somehow slid along the countdown with me, instead of staying put. A loop would have given me the same number twice. This wasn't repeating. It was descending around something, like I was going down a spiral instead of a straight line, and the barn was just a fixed point on the coil. Somewhere in there, I saw headlights coming the other direction, and for one grateful second, my chest loosened, the plain animal relief of not being alone on a bad stretch of road. I flashed my brights, the trucker's hello, and got nothing back. As we passed each other, I got a look at the rig, another Kenworth, older model, hauling a dry van with a company name on the side I recognized from 20 years ago, a hauler that folded sometime before Carol got sick. The driver was sitting straight up behind the wheel, both hands at 10 and 2, staring dead ahead through his windshield, like a man driving a simulator. No reaction to my lights at all. I watched him shrink in my mirror and didn't feel any better for having seen him. Worse, if anything. I needed to stop moving for a minute, get my hands around something that wasn't the wheel. So I pulled into the little rest area up near the pass, the one with the 2 vault toilets and the vending machine that's been broken since I started driving this route. Except it wasn't broken. It was lit up, humming, stocked with candy bars priced at 35 cents, and next to it stood a payphone, the actual box kind with the metal cord, that they'd torn out of that rest stop back when I still had dark hair. I stood there a long time before I picked it up. There was a dial tone. I don't know what made me do it, but I dialed the number of the house Carol and I lived in for 26 years, the number that got disconnected the year after she died. It rang twice. On the 3rd ring, somebody picked up, and there was breathing on the other end, and for about 2 seconds I let myself believe it was her, before the line went to that same rhythmic static and cut out. I hung the phone back on its cradle real gentle, like I didn't want to startle whatever had been listening, and got back in the truck. The marker I passed, leaving that rest stop, wasn't the reflective aluminum kind DOT uses. It was a post of gray weathered wood, waist high, with the number carved into it by hand, deep grooves, gone soft at the edges from age and weather. It read 4, not mile 4, just 4, like whatever measuring this road was using didn't share our units anymore, only our habit of counting. I ran my headlights over the tree line on both sides, trying to get my bearings from the ridge, the way I have 10,000 times on that pass, and the shape of the mountains against the sky was wrong, not dramatically. Not some jagged alien skyline, just off by a few degrees, in a way that took me a full minute to place. The peaks a little too rounded. The notch where the summit should sit, shifted, maybe half a mile east of where 34 years had taught my eyes to expect it. It looked enough like Sherman Pass to fool a man at 54 miles an hour in the dark. It was not Sherman Pass. The woodpost count kept dropping. 3, 2, 1. Somewhere around there, the fog came up off the road surface itself, not blowing in from the trees the way weather does, just rising out of the asphalt like the ground was sweating it, and the pavement changed under my tires, a texture I felt more than heard, smoother, older. I had maybe 2 seconds to decide whether to stop the truck right there and wait it out, or keep my foot steady on the pedal and drive through whatever was coming. I thought about Carol, something she used to say on the bad ice years, when I'd call her from a chained-up rig stuck behind an accident on the pass, that you never stop moving on a bad road. You just get yourself through it. Stopping is how you get killed by the next thing coming up behind you. I don't know if that applied to this. I kept driving anyway, because it was the only thing I had left that felt like mine. The post at 0 didn't have a number on it at all, just the carved grooves worn down to nothing, and past it the fog thinned out fast, and the road under me was blacktop again, familiar blacktop, and up ahead I saw the lit sign for the Colville Truck Stop Diner, glowing against the dark like something out of a dream you're grateful to wake up from. I checked my mirrors, my gauges, my hands on the wheel, and everything read normal. Diesel gauge where it should be. Clock on the dash said 20 to 4 in the morning. I pulled in, cut the engine, and sat there a while, just listening to it tick as it cooled, which is a sound I've heard 10,000 times and never once been so glad to hear. Cheryl was working the counter, same as always, same faded apron, same tired kindness in her face, and she poured my coffee without me asking, and for a few minutes, I let myself believe the whole thing had been exhaustion, some kind of waking dream. A man's mind cooks up alone, on a dark road, at 61 years old. My hands had even stopped shaking by the time the coffee arrived. I pulled my logbook out of my jacket to note my arrival time, same as I've done every night of this job. Muscle memory older than most of my other memories. The page was already filled in, my handwriting, the cramped slant of it I'd know anywhere, logging a stop I hadn't made yet, a fuel purchase I hadn't made yet, 20 minutes ahead of the time on the clock above the counter. And underneath that entry, in a hand almost like mine but not quite, like somebody had traced my writing without ever having held a pen the same way I do, was one more line, time-stamped further out still, describing where I'd be an hour from now, a stretch of road I hadn't chosen yet, a mile marker number I hadn't seen yet. I looked up at the clock. then back down at the page, and the ink on that last line was still wet. I was 9 the first time my father let me ride the overnight run with him, and I'd begged for it for 2 years before he finally gave in. He drove long haul out of a yard outside Spokane, mostly produce and dry goods, and that particular week he had a load going through the mountains on a route he usually avoided because it added 40 minutes to the trip. My mother packed me a duffel bag like I was going to camp. I remember the smell of the cab more than almost anything from that age. Hot vinyl, pine air freshener shaped like a tree, the paper bag of sunflower seeds wedged between the seats. My father had his coffee in a dented steel thermos, and he let me pour it for him at the rest stops, which felt like the most important job in the world. We came up through the switchbacks a little before dusk on the second day. The trees on that stretch grew close to the shoulder, tall enough that the light came through in strips, and there was one spot where the road opened up onto an overlook, a gap in the tree line where you could see the valley drop away for what felt like a mile. My father always slowed there, not because the road demanded it, just habit, he said. A good place to check your mirrors before the next grade. That evening, as we came around the bend, I saw her standing right at the edge of the tree line below the overlook, close enough to the drop that any grown adult would have felt their stomach turn just looking at her. She wasn't dressed for the weather. It was late September, and cold enough that I had a jacket zipped to my chin, and she was standing there in a pale dress, with her arms hanging at her sides, barefoot on rock that would have been freezing. What got me, even at 9, even before I understood why it should have gotten me, was how still she was. Not still like someone waiting for a ride. Still like a photograph. Kids that age wave at everything. Dogs, cows, other cars. So I rolled down my window a crack and waved at her, expecting nothing, the way you wave at a scarecrow. She waved back, but not right away. There was a gap, maybe a second and a half, maybe 2, longer than it should have taken for a simple reflex. And when her arm came up, it was the wrong arm. She mirrored me instead of matching me, which is a strange thing for a 9-year-old to notice, and an even stranger thing for that 9-year-old to remember 30 years later. But I did, because something about the delay bothered me, in a way I didn't have words for yet. My father didn't say anything. I looked over at him, because I wanted him to see her too, and that's when I noticed his hands. They'd gone white on the wheel, both of them, knuckles standing up like they belonged to someone else's hands, grafted onto my father's arms. He didn't slow down, and he didn't speed up. He just drove, staring straight ahead, and he didn't touch the CB for the rest of that shift, which was unheard of for him, because normally, he talked to half the drivers on the interstate like they were old friends at a bar. He never took that route again. I didn't understand it then. I thought maybe the company had changed his assignments, or the extra 40 minutes had finally caught up with the paycheck. It wasn't until I was lying in bed a few nights later, supposed to be asleep, that I heard him and my mother in the kitchen, and heard him say, "Low," like he was trying to keep it inside the room and failing. "I'm not taking him through there again, Carol. Not after what happened last time." My mother asked him what he meant by last time, and he didn't answer her. Or if he did, I didn't hear it, because right then my mother's chair scraped back hard against the linoleum, and the conversation dropped to nothing. That was the version of the story I carried around for 20 years. A ghost story, basically. The kind you tell at a bonfire when you're trying to scare a girl into scooting closer to you. I told it that way plenty of times myself. My father got sick when I was 25. Lungs. The kind of thing you'd expect from 30 years of diesel exhaust and unfiltered Marlboros. And he died the following spring. I was the one who cleared out his truck when the company finally released it back to us. And underneath the passenger seat, taped to the metal frame where the seat bolted down, I found a spiral notebook wrapped in a freezer bag. It had water damage along one edge, and his handwriting had faded to almost nothing on the early pages, but I could make out mile markers, dates, short notes, half a line each. Some of the dates were from years before I was born. One of them, near the front, was dated 11 years before my father even had his own rig, back when he would have still been riding as a second driver for my grandfather. That was the first time I understood that whatever had happened on that overlook hadn't happened to us. It had happened before us, and my father had known about it long before I ever rolled down that window. I got my CDL 2 years after he died. I told people it was because the pay was steady, and I liked the solitude, and both of those things were true. But if I'm honest with myself now, I think some part of me wanted to drive that road and see if it was still there. I never planned it as an investigation. It started the way most real ones do, by accident, at a truck stop diner outside Missoula, where I mentioned my father's old company to a driver twice my age, refilling his coffee at the next stool. He asked if that was the outfit that used to run the old mountain route before the interstate went in, and when I said yes, he set his cup down and said, without me bringing up a single detail, "You mean the one with the girl on the ridge?" I hadn't said a word about her. I hadn't even said the word ridge. After that, I couldn't leave it alone. There's a retired ham radio operator, the kind of man who's been recording CB chatter onto cassette and then digital files for 40 years, because he likes the sound of human voices more than music, and he had transcripts going back to the 70s. I spent 3 weekends at his kitchen table going through them, and what I found wasn't one story. It was the same story, told by different men who'd never met each other, spanning 5 decades. A girl at the tree line, pale dress, no shoes, standing too close to the drop to be safe, and too still to be alive, in the way we mean when we say alive. 50 years of drivers describing the exact same girl, in the exact same spot, down to details they couldn't have copied from each other, because half of them had never spoken to another trucker who'd seen her. What took me longer to notice, because it required cross-referencing dates against something other than sightings, was that the story only ever turned bad for the drivers who waved back, the ones who saw her and just kept driving, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Nothing happened to them beyond a story to tell at a diner. But every driver in that log who admitted to raising a hand to her had something follow him home. Sleep trouble. A pullback toward that stretch of road they couldn't explain to their wives. 2 of them, according to newspaper clippings I found on microfiche in a county library, were reported missing themselves. Years later, their rigs found empty on shoulders, nowhere near that mountain, engines still running. I had waved at her when I was 9 years old. The missing persons search took the longest, because I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. A girl, 16, vanished from a logging camp near that same stretch of road in 1958, more than a decade before the first CB report I'd found. Her name was Eleanor. The report noted she'd last been seen walking toward the ridge in a pale house dress, no shoes, because she'd left in a hurry after an argument with her older brother, who worked the same camp driving loaded trucks down the mountain for a timber outfit. The brother's name was in the file too, listed as the last person to speak with her. It was my grandfather's name. I sat with that for a long time before I called my mother and asked if my father had ever mentioned a sister he'd lost. She went quiet, in a way that told me the answer, before she gave it. She said my father almost never spoke about his father's family, only that there had been an aunt who died young, before my father was born, and that my grandfather had refused to discuss it for the rest of his life. She said the one time she'd pushed my father on it, early in their marriage, he'd told her that his father used to say the mountain had taken his sister and never given her a proper place to rest, and that he'd raised my father to never stop the truck on that overlook, not for anything, not even a dropped map or a full bladder. Somewhere in the ham operator's archive, buried in a transcript from a night nearly 15 years after I'd waved at her, I found my father's CB handle, one he'd used for exactly 6 months, and then never again. In it, he was warning another driver off that stretch of road, telling him to keep his windows up past the old overlook no matter what he saw. The other driver had asked him how he knew, and my father's answer, typed out flat on the page by a man who had no idea what he was transcribing, read, "She waved back at my boy once. I don't want to find out what that means twice." He'd known. He'd spent the 6 months after that drive quietly trying to keep other men's sons out of it, and then he'd gone quiet again, the way he went quiet about everything that scared him, and driven a different road for the rest of his life. I have a daughter now. She's 8. 3 months ago, the company I drive for lost a contract on the interstate lane and rerouted half our loads back through the old mountain pass to save on fuel. The first time freight had run that stretch in decades, and I didn't tell them no, because some stubborn, stupid part of me had been waiting 15 years for exactly that assignment. I brought my daughter along on a Saturday run, the way my father brought me, because I wanted to see it again as an adult before I decided anything about the rest of it. We came around the bend at dusk, same time of day, same slant of light through the trees, and she was there, at the edge of the drop, exactly as still as I remembered her, exactly as unprepared for the cold. My daughter saw her before I could say a word, and lifted her hand to wave, the way any kid would, the way I had. I caught her wrist before her hand came all the way up, told her to keep it down, keep it in her lap, don't look away from me. She did, because she's a good kid, and because something in my voice must have told her I wasn't playing a game. But Eleanor had already seen the hand start to rise. I watched it in the mirror as we passed, that half-second delay, and this time I didn't drive on. I pulled the rig onto the shoulder past the overlook, told my daughter to stay buckled with the doors locked, and I walked back along the gravel toward the tree line by myself, which is the one thing in 50 years of that road that no driver in any of those logs had ever done. The engine doesn't sputter or give any warning. It just stops, mid-hum, like something reached in and pulled the plug. Cole Reyes coasts another 30 feet on momentum alone, before the truck rolls dead against the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and then nothing. No dash lights, no radio, no headlights bleeding into the tree line ahead of him, just the tick of a cooling engine block and the black wall of pine that runs along both sides of Forest Road 25, somewhere past the last turnoff before Cougar, with Mount St. Helens sitting unseen and enormous, somewhere off to his left in the dark. He tries the key twice. Nothing. Not even the click of a dead battery trying to turn over. Total silence. Like the truck simply decided to stop being a truck. His phone has been dead to the world since the last ridge. One bar flickering in and out for the past 40 minutes before giving up completely. He sits there a second, hands on the wheel, doing the math on how long it's been since he passed another vehicle. 40 minutes, maybe longer. There's a CB radio bolted under the dash, an old Cobra unit his father wired in years ago, before he handed the truck down. The kind of relic Cole never uses because who still runs a CB in a world with GPS and cell towers? But out here, in a dead zone with a dead phone, it's the only working piece of technology he's got left, so he thumbs it on and watches the little orange light stutter awake. He turns the dial to channel 9, the emergency channel, the one his dad drilled into him before he could drive. 9's for trouble, 9's for when nobody else can hear you. He lifts the mic, thumb finding the button, and before he can press it, before he's said a single word into that microphone, the speaker crackles, and a voice reads his license plate number back to him. Not close, not almost right. Exact. Every letter, every digit, in the flat, slightly clipped cadence of something that isn't quite a person reading off a card. Cole doesn't move. He stares at the little grill of the speaker like it's going to explain itself. He hasn't keyed the mic. He hasn't said a word. Nobody knows he's on this road tonight. Not his boss, not his ex. Nobody. He sets his thumb on the button again, presses it down without saying anything, holds it a beat, and lets it go. Silence. 3 seconds of static. Then the voice comes back, and this time it doesn't repeat the plate. It gives coordinates. A string of numbers that means nothing to him until he glances down at the dead phone in the cup holder and sees, absurdly, that the last GPS ping it caught before it died is sitting frozen on the screen. The numbers match. Not close. Match. The voice tells him, in that same flattened, unhurried tone, to hold his position until sunrise. Not a question, not an offer. An instruction, delivered like a machine reading a script, and something about the rhythm of it. No breath sounds, no static crackle of a human throat clearing, makes the hair go up on his arms, because that's not how CB chatter sounds. That's not a trucker. That's not a person keying a mic from 40 miles down the valley. He flips the channel dial, thinking maybe it's bleed-through, some freak overlap jamming channel 9 specifically. He tries 11, 19, 23, spinning through every band he can find. And the same voice is waiting on every single one of them, mid-sentence, like it never stopped talking, like it doesn't matter which channel he picks, because it's not confined to a channel at all. That shouldn't be possible. CB radios don't work that way. Something is riding every frequency at once, and whatever it is, it's doing it from somewhere close enough to drown out anything else on the band. His phone buzzes. One bar, flickering to life, just long enough to deliver a single text from a number he doesn't recognize. No name, no contact, just 10 digits and a photograph. The photo is his truck. His truck, from behind, taken from somewhere in the tree line off the shoulder, time-stamped 90 seconds earlier, which means whoever sent it isn't monitoring a satellite feed or a traffic database. They were standing close enough, in the last hour and a half, to take a picture of him sitting exactly where he's sitting now. He gets out. He doesn't want to, but sitting still with that photo glowing on his screen feels worse than moving. He walks the shoulder, with his phone flashlight cutting a thin cone through the dark, and it takes him almost 10 minutes of sweeping the tree line before he finds it. A small black box, zip-tied to a Douglas fir about waist height. A single red light blinking on its face every 4 seconds. Patient and mechanical. A trail camera. The kind hunters strap to trees to catch deer on a game trail. Nothing supernatural about it. Just a physical, ordinary little machine, bolted to a tree on a public forest road, watching him right now. And for one long breath, that almost feels like relief. He remembers, standing there with his thumb still holding the light steady, a headline he skimmed months ago on his phone during a lunch break. Something about a joint task force out of Scarystories County, running a camera network through the forest after a string of arrests. Poachers moving elk carcasses out at night. Maybe timber theft too. He can't remember the details. Only that there'd been talk of surveillance cameras going up along the back roads to catch trucks running product out under cover of dark. That would explain it. Official. Boring even. A camera clocking his plate. A system flagging a stranded vehicle. Some automated dispatch reading numbers off a database. He almost laughs, walking back toward the truck, already rehearsing how he's going to tell this story later, as the night the Forest Service radio spooked him half to death. Then the voice comes back through the Cobra's speaker as he climbs back in, and it says his first name. Not his plate, not his coordinates. Cole. Then, a beat later, in that same unbothered cadence, it mentions Denise, his ex-wife's name, a name that has no business being anywhere near a task force database, and it says the word Ferncrest, the street he grew up on, the street his mother still lives on, 40 miles from any camera bolted to any tree out here. The relief he'd built for himself 30 seconds earlier collapses all at once, and underneath it is something colder. Because now he understands, this was never about the road. It was never about traffic through a stretch of national forest. Whatever this is, it's about him, specifically, and it has been, for longer than tonight. He sits with his hands flat on the wheel, forcing himself to think instead of just feel, his pulse climbing, and that's when it surfaces. 3 weeks ago, an email from his insurance company. A little plastic dongle that plugs into the diagnostic port under the dash. Track your driving habits. Save up to 20%. Dozens of his coworkers already running them. He'd plugged it in without thinking twice. The way you agree to cookies on a website. He reaches down now with his phone light and finds it clipped under the steering column, exactly where he left it. A small gray rectangle with a single LED that should be dark with the engine off. It isn't. It's lit. Faint, but steady, green. That's the moment the shape of the night changes for him. Not a haunted road, not a government camera, but his own truck, quietly reporting his location, his speed, his habits, to a server somewhere. And something, or someone, has gotten into that feed and is riding it straight into his cab through a 30-year-old CB radio that was never built to receive digital traffic in the first place. He doesn't know who, he doesn't know why. But he knows now that whatever's talking to him has been listening to his life for weeks, maybe longer, and that thought sits in his chest, heavier than the cold coming through the window. Down the road, headlights swing into view. Far off still, maybe half a mile, crawling at a pace too slow to be someone just driving through. No brake flare, no deceleration. A vehicle that was already moving slow, and is staying slow, aimed right at him. He kills his hazards without thinking, drops low in the seat, watches the lights grow through the windshield in absolute silence except for his own breathing. It's a white pickup, a green Forest Service decal on the door, catching the last of its own headlights as it slows. It stops maybe 80 yards back, and just sits there, engine idling, headlights aimed at his tailgate, and nobody gets out. A minute passes. 2. He can see a shape behind the wheel, motionless, not reaching for a door handle, not radioing anyone, just watching him the way you'd watch something you're deciding what to do with. Every instinct in him says wave, walk toward it, ask for help. And every instinct after that says don't, not yet, not until you understand what you're waving down. Then, without warning, the truck eases forward, turns down a service spur maybe 40 yards up the road that Cole hadn't even clocked in the dark, and disappears between the trees, tail lights shrinking to nothing. It was never coming for him at all. It had somewhere else to be. Which should feel like relief, and instead feels like the opposite. Because if that truck has business out here at 1 in the morning that has nothing to do with him, then whatever's happening on this road tonight is bigger than one stranded vehicle, and he is nothing more than something it happened to drive past. The Cobra crackles again, and this time the voice is different. Softer, slower, still synthetic, still that flattened text-to-speech cadence. But something in the pacing has shifted, like whoever's typing this into a machine is choosing the words more carefully now. Don't let them find the dongle, it says. Leave it where it is. Don't touch it again. And for the first time all night, the voice doesn't sound like it's hurting him. It sounds like it's trying to keep him from making a mistake. He sits with that for a long moment, turning it over, and a different possibility opens up in him, one that hadn't occurred to him because he'd been so sure from the first sentence that the voice was the threat. What if it isn't? What if somebody, somewhere, found a way into the same feed that's been broadcasting his location all night? Not the one doing it to him, but someone who discovered it. Someone using a stolen or hacked backend to type warnings through a text-to-speech relay because they can't risk using their own voice, can't risk being traced back to whatever server they've broken into. Not an enemy. A person watching the same danger he is, from somewhere he can't see, doing the only thing they can to reach him. An old emergency channel that nobody uses anymore, on a stretch of road where nothing else works. He keys the mic for the first time all night and asks who this is. The silence afterward stretches longer than any before it, long enough that he thinks the connection, whatever it is, has finally died. Then it answers, and what comes through isn't a name, it's an explanation, delivered flat and fast, like someone racing a clock. Fleet dongles like his can be remotely triggered to kill a vehicle's ignition system, a feature meant for stolen car recovery that also works, in the wrong hands, as a way to strand a target exactly where you want them. Kill the truck, wait for a call to a dispatch number that isn't really a tow company, send a crew out that looks like roadside assistance and isn't. It's happened before, more than once. Cole's truck didn't break down. It was switched off, on purpose, from somewhere else. The same way his phone had gone dark right on schedule. The same way that trail camera had been waiting on that exact tree. The instruction to hold until sunrise stops sounding like a trap and starts sounding like the only strategy that makes sense. Because whoever runs a scheme like that needs the dark, needs empty roads and no witnesses, and a story that sounds like ordinary bad luck. Daylight brings traffic. Daylight brings other people who might actually stop. Staying put isn't obedience anymore. It's the only version of this night where he isn't handing them exactly what they want. Somewhere past 3 in the morning, a second set of headlights turns onto the road behind him, closer this time, unhurried, and a tow truck rig eases up with a light bar on the roof and a magnetic company decal on the door that Cole doesn't recognize from anywhere around here, not from any shop in Cougar or Randall or Woodland. 2 men climb out, moving easy, friendly, calling out that dispatch sent them for a stranded vehicle, and Cole, sitting frozen behind the wheel with the mic already in his hand, does the only thing he can think to do. He keys channel 9 wide open and starts talking, loud, clear, giving his location, his plate, a plain description of both men and their rig, broadcasting the whole exchange live into the dark, in the hope that somewhere out there, on some ridge, or in some rig, rolling down a highway 30 miles off, another trucker still runs the old channel the way his father used to swear by it, because 9's for trouble, 9's for when nobody else can hear you, and right now, it's the only lifeline he's got that isn't wired into the same system that got him stranded in the first place. One of the men's smiles falters, just slightly, at the sound of Cole's voice carrying clean out of the dash speaker into the open night air, loud enough to reach past the cab. They exchange a look, and for the first time since the engine died, they hesitate. Sunrise comes up gray behind the ridgeline instead of gold, the kind of flat morning light that makes everything look like it's been drained of color, and it comes with the sound Cole has been waiting 6 hours to hear. Tires on gravel. A real one this time. A Skamania County cruiser rolling up slow with its light bar already going. Having taken a call relayed 40 minutes earlier from a landline out past Cougar, a woman's voice reporting a possible robbery in progress on Forest Road 25, and reading off a plate number she had no obvious way of knowing. The tow rig is still there when the deputy arrives, one of the two men halfway back into the cab, the other standing in the headlights with his hands already coming up. It takes Cole 3 days and 2 conversations with a detective before he learns who'd been talking to him all night. Not a machine, not a task force, but a woman working out of a decommissioned fire lookout an hour up the ridge, repurposed years ago into a relay hut for a logging company's radio network, who'd found a back door into the same telematics servers the tow crew had been using to pick their targets, after her brother had been robbed and beaten on a stretch of dark highway, 2 counties over the previous winter, left for dead beside his own dead truck, by 2 men in a tow rig nobody could ever trace. She'd spent months teaching herself the parts of the system nobody thought to lock, routing warnings through a text-to-speech relay onto the only frequency old enough that nobody had bothered to secure it, waiting up every night a new plate pinged dead in that stretch of forest, hoping this time somebody would listen long enough to make it to sunrise. Roy Bellamy had 39 years of trucking behind him, and this was the last night of it. One more run, Aberdeen to Tacoma, the same stretch of Washington Timber Road he'd driven so many times, he could probably do it with his eyes shut, though he never once let himself try. He'd told his daughter he wanted to do this final haul alone. No escort, no company truck trailing behind with a banner on it. Nothing like that. Just him, the rig, and the road he'd spent most of his adult life on. The company had thrown him a small party that afternoon. Cake in the break room, a few handshakes, a watch he'd probably never wear. Now it was past 9 at night. Rain coming down steady on the windshield, wipers ticking back and forth, and the only light for miles was his own headlights cutting through wet fir trees, standing close on both sides of the 2-lane road. He had his coffee in the cup holder, gone lukewarm an hour ago, and a photograph of his wife Carol clipped to the visor, the same photograph that had ridden with him for 11 years since she passed. He talked to her sometimes on long runs. Habit, not madness. Tonight, he'd been telling her about the party, about how strange it felt to be doing something for the last time, after so many years of it just being Tuesday. He never picked up hitchhikers. Company policy forbade it. Insurance forbade it. And honestly, his own gut had forbidden it since a bad scare back in the 90s he didn't like thinking about. So when he came around the bend past the old way station and saw a man standing at the shoulder in the rain, no umbrella, no raincoat, just a canvas jacket soaked through, Roy's foot should have stayed on the gas. That was the plan, every single time headlights caught someone standing at the edge of that road. Keep moving. Let the next car worry about it. He didn't know why he slowed down. He'd turn that question over in his head for a long time afterward, and never land on a real answer. Maybe it was the last night of it feeling making him soft. Maybe it was the way the man wasn't waving his arms or holding up a sign, wasn't doing any of the things a person trying to catch a ride usually does, just standing there, with his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for a bus that ran on a schedule only he knew. Whatever it was, Roy found himself easing off the pedal, then pulling the air brakes, the hiss of them loud in the quiet cab, and rolling to a stop 30 yards past the man. The hitchhiker didn't run to catch up. He walked, unhurried, like the truck stopping was simply what he'd expected to happen. Roy leaned over and pushed the door open, and the man climbed in, without much conversation, just a nod and a low, obliged, and settled into the passenger seat Roy hadn't had anyone sit in for longer than he could remember. He was older, Roy guessed, 70s maybe, with a gray beard kept close, and eyes that didn't have the darting, nervous look most hitchhikers carried. He smelled like pipe tobacco and wet wool. He didn't ask where Roy was headed. He didn't offer his own name either, and Roy, still getting the truck back up to speed, didn't press it. It was maybe 10 minutes down the road when the man said something that made Roy's hands tighten on the wheel. He mentioned Carol by name, said something about how she used to put a thermos of chicory coffee on the porch rail for Roy on the mornings he left before dawn, back when they lived on the old place outside Riverbend. Roy hadn't lived on that property in over 15 years. He hadn't mentioned Carol out loud to a living soul in this cab, not once, only ever to her photograph. He asked the man, carefully, how he knew that. The hitchhiker just said, "Small towns talk," and looked out the window like the subject didn't interest him much. Roy told himself that was probably true. Riverbend was small. People remembered things. He'd let it go. But the man kept talking, easy and unbothered, the way you talk to someone you've known 30 years, and every few minutes, another detail slipped out that didn't belong to a stranger. He mentioned the color Roy's first rig had been, a green International that had been retired from service before some of Roy's current co-workers were born. He mentioned, almost offhand, that Roy used to keep a pack of cigarettes he never smoked in the glove box, just to have something to offer men like him. Roy hadn't smoked in 20 years, and hadn't kept cigarettes in that glove box in longer than that. But it was true, all of it, every word. Roy's skin had gone tight and cold under his flannel, though the heater was running fine. He kept his eyes on the road and asked the man straight out who he was. The hitchhiker didn't answer that either. Instead, he said, calm as anything, "Don't take the Blackwater cutoff tonight." Roy frowned. The Blackwater cutoff was the shortcut he'd taken on this exact route for over 20 years, shaving 40 minutes off the drive home, a stretch of narrow logging road that wound down through the ridge before meeting back up with the highway near Riverbend. It was the road he'd been planning to take tonight, same as every night. "Why not?" Roy asked, and the man said, "Because you already lost one friend to it. Don't want to make it two roads." That stopped Roy cold inside, though he kept the truck steady. He knew exactly what the man meant, and it took him a second to place how a total stranger could know it too. Back in '94, a friend of his named Dutch Halloran, a trucker who'd taught Roy half of what he knew about handling a rig on wet mountain grades, had gone missing on that cutoff. Truck found empty, engine still running, driver's door open, no Dutch, no explanation, nothing the county ever turned up in 3 months of looking. It had been in the papers for a week, and then, like most things, forgotten by everyone, except the people who'd actually known him. Roy had never told anyone in this truck about Dutch. Not once in 30 years. He was about to ask the man how he possibly knew that name, when the CB radio crackled to life on the dash, cutting through the cab with a burst of static, and a voice Roy recognized as Denny Ruiz, another driver he'd known for years, running the same corridor tonight. Denny's voice was tight, hurried, the way it got when something real was happening and not just chatter. He was telling anyone listening to steer clear of the Blackwater cutoff, said a logging truck had lost its load coming down grade, whole trailer jackknifed across both lanes, timber scattered everywhere, and at least one vehicle involved, ambulance already called. Denny said it happened maybe 20 minutes ago. Roy did the math without wanting to. 20 minutes ago was almost exactly when he would have been turning onto that cutoff, same as he had 1,000 times before, if he hadn't slowed down for a man standing in the rain. Roy's hands were shaking a little on the wheel now, not from fear exactly, more from the feeling of the floor tilting under something he thought was solid ground. He turned to the passenger seat to say something, To ask the man how in God's name he could have known that before Denny's voice ever came over the radio, and the seat was empty. Not empty like the man had ducked down. Empty like nobody had sat there in hours. The seat cushion wasn't even damp, though the man's jacket had been soaked through when he climbed in. There was no sound of a door opening, no gust of cold air, nothing. Roy looked at the floor mat, at the door handle, at the mirror, like the man might be crouched somewhere impossible, and there was nothing there at all except, resting on the seat where the man's hip would have been, a small brass matchbox, old and dented at one corner, the kind loggers used to carry decades back. Roy pulled the truck onto the shoulder with his heart going hard against his ribs, and sat there a long moment with the engine idling and the wipers still ticking. He picked up the matchbox with a hand that wasn't quite steady and turned it over. Scratched into the bottom of it, worn but legible, were 2 letters and a date. DH and a year, 94. He didn't take the Blackwater cutoff that night. He took the long way home, the highway all the way around, an extra 50 minutes of driving on his very last run, and he didn't turn the radio off once, kept it on low the whole way, though nothing else came over it that meant anything to him. When he pulled into the yard past midnight and cut the engine for the last time in his working life, he sat in the cab a good while before he could make himself get out. He asked around after that, the way a man does when something won't leave him alone. Called an old dispatcher he trusted, went through what county records still existed from '94, even drove out to Riverbend one weekend and talked to a woman at the Historical Society who remembered Dutch Halloran's disappearance, the way small towns remember anything strange that never got explained. She had a photograph of him from a company picture day. Work jacket, close beard, steady eyes. Roy looked at it a long time and didn't say anything about what he saw in it. She never asked why he wanted to know, and he never told her. He kept the matchbox in his truck for the 2 years after retirement that he still owned the thing, and then it rode along in his coat pocket after that, empty of matches, just the brass shell of it worn smooth from his thumb, running over those 2 letters more times than he could count. He never got an answer. Not from the county, not from Denny, not from anyone who might have known Dutch and had some ordinary explanation for how a man could describe a wreck before it happened. Some things you carry your whole life without ever getting to set them down properly. Roy figured that was just part of what the road gives you, after enough years on it. You drive it long enough, it starts driving something back into you. He never took another route through timber country after dark without thinking of that stretch of road, and every so often, on nights when the rain came in steady the way it had that night, he'd find himself glancing at the shoulder as he passed, half expecting, half hoping, to see somebody standing there waiting on a ride he already knew he'd stop and give.